Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Frank Morrison, and I've been a park ranger for 19 years. Before that, I spent 13 months in the jungles of Vietnam, which taught me two things: how to stay alive when everything wants to kill you, and how to tell when something's really wrong with a place. People think being a ranger is all about helping lost hikers and putting out campfires. Most days, that's true. But sometimes you run into things that make you question everything you thought you knew about the world. I grew up in coal country, where my daddy worked the mines until black lung took him when I was 16. After Vietnam, I couldn't handle being underground, so I took a job with the Forest Service. Spent 2 decades learning every deer trail, every water source, every hidden cave across 40,000 acres of George Washington National Forest. The old-timers used to tell stories about Devil's Backbone Ridge, strange tales about children who weren't quite right, who played games in the deep woods and sang songs that made grown men cry. I always figured it was just mountain folklore, stories to keep kids from wandering too far from camp. I should have listened to those old-timers. It was late September of 1976, during one of those Indian summers that feels like the earth can't decide what season it wants to be. The humidity hung at 95%, thick enough to cut with a knife. Morning fog rolled through the hollows like smoke, and the air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. I was working out of the Sharando Lake Station that week, covering for a ranger who'd broken his leg. It's beautiful country up there, but isolated. Nearest backup was 30 miles away over winding mountain roads. Radio worked fine on the ridges, but down in the hollows, you might as well be shouting into a tin can. Cell phones were still science fiction in those days. The Cherokee used to live in these mountains. They had stories about the Yunwi Tsunsdi, little people who lived in the forest. But these weren't the helpful fairy folk from children's books. According to the legends, they were children who died of sickness long ago, trapped between worlds, always hungry for what they'd lost. I never put much stock in Indian legends. Figured they were just trying to explain things they didn't understand, like why people went missing in the deep woods. That was my first mistake. The trouble started when the Henderson family didn't check out on Monday morning. Bob Henderson had reserved Site 12 for the weekend. Him, his wife Linda, and their 2 kids, Emma and Tyler, 8 and 6 years old, cute as buttons from what the camp host remembered. The Hendersons were experienced campers from Richmond. Bob was a bank manager, the type who kept detailed trip plans and always followed the rules. When they didn't show up at the office by noon to settle their bill, the camp host called me. I drove over in my truck, expecting to find them sleeping off a late night around the campfire. Instead, I found something that made my skin crawl. Their campsite looked like they'd just stepped away for a minute. Coffee was still warm in the pot. Bacon sat half-cooked in the pan, grease still sizzling. 2 bowls of oatmeal sat on the picnic table, spoons still in them, milk not even soured yet. But nobody was there. What really got my attention were the toys. Someone had arranged all the kids' dolls and action figures in a perfect circle around the dead campfire. Every single toy faced inward, like they were staring at something in the center of the ring. The sight of it made my stomach turn over, though I couldn't say why. I called out for the family, my voice echoing off the ridge walls. Nothing came back but silence. Not just quiet, wrong silence. No insects buzzing despite. The warm weather, no birds calling. Even the wind seemed muted, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I started looking for tracks. Found them easy enough. 2 sets of small footprints leading into the woods, Emma and Tyler from the size of them. But something was off about those prints. The impressions looked old, worn smooth like old leather, even though they couldn't have been made more than a few hours ago. That's when my compass started acting up. The needle spun in lazy circles whenever I got close to that ring of toys. I tapped the glass, thinking maybe I'd dropped it, but the spinning got worse. Then I tried my radio to call for backup. Instead of static, I heard children laughing. Not the happy sound of kids playing. This was different. Cold, hungry laughter that seemed to come from very far away and very close at the same time. I clicked the radio off so fast I nearly dropped it. The temperature around that campsite felt 10 degrees cooler than the rest of the forest. I could see my breath when I stood near those arranged toys, even though it was 75 degrees everywhere else. I knew I needed help, but I also knew those children's tracks were getting older by the minute. In Vietnam, I'd learned that when people go missing, the first few hours are everything. Wait too long, and you're looking for bodies instead of survivors. I followed the footprints into the woods. The trail led deeper into the mountains than any 8-year-old should have been able to walk. It wound through thick rhododendron bushes and over fallen logs, following what looked like an old Cherokee hunting path most people didn't even know existed. 20 minutes into the woods, I found Linda Henderson. She was at the bottom of a sinkhole, maybe 15 feet down, neck broken, eyes wide open, staring up at nothing. The expression on her face was pure terror. Not the kind you see in accidents, but the look of someone who died seeing something impossible. But that wasn't the worst part. Around Linda's body, pressed deep into the muddy bottom of the sinkhole, were dozens of small handprints, child-sized, like a bunch of kids had been playing around her body. When I shined my flashlight down there, those handprints seemed to glow with a faint blue light. I radioed for the coroner and a recovery team, then kept following those tracks. They led further up the ridge, along Devil's Backbone Trail. That's when I realized I'd been walking for what felt like 6 hours, but the sun hadn't moved in the sky. My watch had stopped at 2:17. Jake Mitchell, my partner, arrived with the search team around what should have been sunset, but the light never changed. Temperature dropped another 10 degrees when Jake got near that toy circle back at the campsite. Even the search dogs acted spooked. They'd follow the scent about 100 yards into the woods, then start whining and backing away. We found Bob Henderson a quarter-mile up the trail. He was alive, but barely. Sitting against an oak tree, staring at nothing, hair gone completely white. When we first spotted him, I thought we'd found the wrong person. Bob Henderson was 42 years old, but the man sitting by that tree looked 70. His skin was spotted with liver marks that hadn't been there 3 days ago. Cataracts clouded his eyes. His hands shook with arthritis, and when we helped him stand, his back was bent like an old man's. "The children," he kept mumbling. "They wanted to play games. Their eyes were so old, so hungry. They sang songs that hurt to hear." The medics said it was impossible. Nobody ages 20 years overnight. But there Bob sat, looking like his own father, mumbling about children with ancient eyes. We were still trying to figure out what happened to Bob when we heard them. Voices, high and sweet, drifting through the evening air. Children singing Ring Around the Rosie, the melody floating down from higher up the ridge. Emma and Tyler were still out there. So Jake and I decided to camp on the trail that night. We took turns on watch, but around 3 in the morning we both heard it clear as day, children's laughter echoing through the hollow, not distressed or scared, happy, like they were having the time of their lives. When dawn started breaking, I saw them. In a moonlit clearing about 50 yards away, a group of children played in a circle. I counted at least 8 of them, maybe more. They were holding hands, spinning around and around, singing that old nursery rhyme. Emma and Tyler Henderson were right there among them. I started toward the clearing, my heart hammering with relief. We'd found them. They were okay, but Jake grabbed my arm. "Look at their shadows," he whispered. The moonlight was bright enough to cast clear shadows on the ground. Every tree, every bush, every rock had a dark outline stretching across the clearing, but the children cast no shadows at all. That's when one of them, a little girl in a torn dress that looked like it came from the 1940s, turned and looked right at me. Her face was Emma Henderson's face, but her eyes were ancient, hungry, like she'd been starving for 100 years. "Come play with us, mister," she called out in Emma's voice. "We know such wonderful games." The other children turned to look at me then, and I saw faces from different decades, different centuries. A boy in pioneer clothes, a girl wearing a dress from the 1920s, all of them with those same ancient starving eyes. Jake stepped forward. "Emma? Tyler?" Your parents are worried about you." The girl who looked like Emma smiled, showing teeth that were too sharp, too white. "These are our parents now. We're never going home." Jake ran toward them then, trying to reach the real Emma and Tyler. One of the children, a boy who couldn't have been more than 5, reached out and touched Jake's hand. My partner screamed. I watched Jake age 40 years in 40 seconds. His brown hair turned white, then fell out. His back bent, his skin wrinkled and spotted. He hit the ground, clutching his chest, and by the time I reached him, Jake Mitchell was dead of old age at 35. The children laughed as he died. That's when I understood what we were dealing with. These weren't children at all, not anymore. They were something else, something that fed on life itself, stealing years and strength with just a touch. The clearing filled with more of them. Dozens of children from different time periods, all with those same hungry, ancient eyes. Some wore buckskin clothes from the 1800s. Others had on Depression-era dresses or 1950s school clothes. They'd been collecting children for over 200 years, I realized. Every missing kid, every family that vanished without a trace in these mountains. The children became part of the collection, and their life force fed whatever kept these things alive. "We've been waiting for you, Ranger Man," said the girl wearing Emma's face. "We love it when grown-ups try to save us. It makes the game more fun." They started moving toward me then, reaching out with those deadly hands. I backed away, remembering something Mary Crow Feather, an old Cherokee woman, had told me years ago about the Yunwi Tsunsdi. "Running water," she'd said. "The little people can't cross running water." Devil's Fork Creek was half a mile through dense forest. I ran. Behind me, children's laughter echoed from every direction. They didn't chase me the normal way. I'd catch glimpses of them ahead of me on the trail, or see them phase through tree trunks like they were made of mist. The forest itself seemed to work against me. Paths I'd walked 100 times before twisted into dead ends. Familiar landmarks appeared in the wrong places. The children were playing with reality itself, turning the woods into a maze. I stumbled through rhododendron thickets, crashed over fallen logs, scraped through thorn bushes that tore at my clothes. All the while, that horrib. The laughter followed me, along with voices calling my name. "Frank, don't you want to play with us? Come back, Frank. The games are just starting. Why are you running, Frank? Don't you like children?" Then I heard another voice, one that made my blood freeze. "Help me, Frank. I'm scared." It was Emma Henderson's voice, but the real Emma this time, not hungry or ancient, terrified. They were using her fear to bait me back. I kept running. Devil's Fork Creek appeared through the trees like salvation itself. I crashed through the last of the bushes and splashed into the cold mountain water, then turned around. The hollow children stood at the creek bank, reaching toward me with grasping fingers, but they couldn't cross. Something about the flowing water held them back like an invisible wall. "This isn't over, Ranger Man," whispered the thing wearing Emma's face. "We'll play again soon. We know where you live. We know where you sleep." The first light of dawn touched the ridgeline, and the children began to fade like mist. But their voices lingered, promising they'd be back when the time was right. The search team found Jake's body the next morning, aged beyond recognition. Emma and Tyler Henderson were discovered in a limestone cave system 3 miles from their campsite. The coroner said they'd been dead for days, which was impossible since I'd seen them alive the night before. The official report blamed environmental exposure and toxic gas pockets that could cause hallucinations. Devil's Backbone Ridge was quietly closed to camping and marked as an unstable geological zone. But I knew better. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. My hearing became unnaturally sharp. I can hear children's laughter from miles away on quiet nights. My compass has never worked right since that night. It always points toward the nearest hollow where those things wait. My marriage didn't survive the nightmares and the way I flinched every time a child came near me. I requested a transfer to parks out west, as far from Appalachian hollows as I could get. But I kept researching. Missing children, unexplained disappearances in mountain communities. The pattern is always the same. Families camping near old Cherokee hunting grounds. Children who vanish without a trace. Sometimes toy circles found around cold campfires. I warn other rangers when I can, though most think I've lost my mind. I tell them to watch for the signs, toys arranged in circles, compasses that spin, children's voices where no children should be. The hollow children are still out there, still playing their games, still collecting. My left hand, where one of them brushed against me during my escape, shows signs of premature aging, liver spots and arthritis that shouldn't be there for another 20 years. Sometimes on foggy autumn nights when the air is thick and still, I hear Emma Henderson calling my name from deep in the forest. Part of me knows it's just my imagination, but another part wonders if some trace of her is still trapped in those hollow children, trying to warn me they're coming back. If you ever find yourself camping in Appalachian country and you hear children playing in the woods at night, don't go looking for them. Don't try to help. Just pack up your gear and get as far away as you can. Because the hollow children are always hungry, and they love it when grown-ups try to save them. It makes the game so much more fun. My name is Patricia Thornfield, but everyone calls me Patty. I've been a ranger on the Blue Ridge Parkway for 14 years now, and I've seen things that would make most folks pack up and move to the city. Bears getting into campers, hikers falling off cliffs, kids getting lost in the woods for days. I'm the search and rescue coordinator for this whole district, and I've pulled more than 200 people out of these mountains alive. I grew up in Boone, so I know these peaks like my own backyard. My daddy taught me to climb before I could ride a bike, and by the time I was 12, I was following deer trails that most grown men wouldn't dare touch. When I got this job, I was the first woman to lead SAR operations in the Blue Ridge District. Some of the old-timers didn't like it much, but after a few successful rescues, they came around. I'm 36 now, divorced, with a teenage son back home who thinks his mom's job is pretty cool but also pretty weird. He's not wrong. This work changes you. When you've held dying people in your arms and talked scared kids through their worst moments, you see the world different. You learn that most dangers are real and immediate. Hypothermia, falling rocks, heart attacks at altitude. The made-up stuff, the ghost stories and local legends, they're just distractions from the actual threats trying to kill you every day. That's why I never put much stock in the Beast of Bladenboro stories that tourists love to whisper about around campfires. North Carolina's got plenty of real predators without inventing new ones. Black bears, coyotes, the occasional mountain lion that wanders down from Virginia. Those animals can kill you plenty dead without adding monster tales to the mix. November 1983 came in cold and mean. The first serious snow hit Grandfather Mountain the second week of the month, and the temperature dropped to 15°. At night. The weather up here changes fast. 1 minute you're hiking in sunshine, the next you're caught in a snow squall that cuts visibility down to 10 feet. It's hunting season, which means more people in the woods than usual, and more chances for things to go wrong. I was working out of the Grandfather Mountain Station that morning when the call came in. 6 hunters from Charlotte had been camping up near Rough Ridge for 3 days, and they wanted to report something big stalking their camp. The guy on the radio sounded shaken, which got my attention. Most hunters who call us are either injured or lost, not scared. I figured it was a problem bear. November's when black bears are trying to pack on weight before winter, and they get bold about raiding camps. I loaded up the truck with tranquilizer equipment and bear relocation supplies. Standard protocol: dart the bear, move it somewhere without people, problem solved. The drive up to Rough Ridge takes about 40 minutes in good weather. That day, with snow coming down and ice on the curves, it took me an hour. The whole way up I kept thinking this felt different somehow. The woods were too quiet. Even with snow falling, you usually hear something. Birds, squirrels, the wind moving through trees. But the forest around me was silent as a grave. I found the hunters' camp set up in a clearing about half a mile from the main trail. 6 guys, all dressed in proper gear, all carrying rifles that could drop a bear at 100 yards. But when I walked into that camp, I saw fear in their eyes like nothing I'd ever seen from armed men in daylight. The group leader was a guy named Carl Rodriguez, maybe 50 years old, built like he did construction work. His hands were shaking when he shook mine, and not from the cold. "Thanks for coming, Ranger," he said. "We got a situation here that's not normal. Tell Me what you've seen, I said, pulling out my incident report pad. Carl pointed to the tree line about 30 yards from their tents. Something's been circling us for 3 nights. Big. Bigger than any bear I've ever seen. But it moves wrong, you know? Too fast. Too smart. Bears are pretty intelligent animals, I said. What makes you think this one's different? Instead of answering, Carl walked me over to a big oak tree at the edge of the clearing. The trunk was marked with claw gouges that started about 8 feet off the ground and went up to 12 feet. I'd seen bear scratch marks before, but never that high. Black bears in North Carolina don't grow big enough to reach 12 feet, even standing on their back legs. There's more, Carl said, his voice barely above a whisper. He led me to a patch of snow about 20 feet from the tree. There, clear as day, were paw prints unlike anything I'd seen in 14 years of mountain work. Each print was 18 inches long, with deep impressions from retractable claws. The stride length was nearly 6 feet. I knelt down and studied the tracks, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The basic shape was bear-like, but the proportions were all wrong. The pads were too long, the claw marks too precise. And there was something else. The snow around each print had melted and refrozen, like the paws had been giving off heat. How long have these been here? I asked. Since this morning, said another hunter, a thin guy who looked like he hadn't slept in days. We've been watching from the tents. Thing came right up to the edge of camp around 3 a.m., left those prints, then just disappeared. I stood up and looked around the clearing. The rational part of my brain was running through explanations. Maybe a really big dog had gotten loose from somewhere. Maybe these guys were pulling some kind of prank. Maybe the snow was playing tricks with depth and making normal bear prints look bigger than they were. But standing there in that silent forest, looking at those impossible tracks, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a little girl afraid of the dark. The feeling that something was watching me from the trees, something that didn't belong in any wildlife manual I'd ever read. I spent the next hour documenting everything I could find. Photos of the claw marks, measurements of the tracks, statements from all 6 hunters. The more evidence I gathered, the less sense any of it made. The hunters told me they'd first noticed something wrong 2 nights ago. They'd been sitting around their campfire when all the normal forest sounds just stopped. No owls, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then they heard branches breaking in the woods around them, like something huge was moving in a wide circle just beyond the firelight. We figured it was a bear checking us out, said Dave Kim, one of the younger guys in the group. Bears do that sometimes, right? Scope out a campsite before deciding if they want to investigate. I nodded. That was normal behavior. What came next wasn't. Around midnight, we started hearing this sound, Dave continued. Like breathing, heavy breathing, but from up high. Like whatever was making it was standing on its back legs looking down at us over the trees. Mike Stevens, the oldest hunter in the group, spoke up. I've been hunting these mountains for 20 years, Ranger. I know what a bear sounds like. This wasn't a bear. What did it sound like? I asked. Mike looked at the other men before answering. Like a person trying to breathe like an animal. Or an animal trying to breathe like a person. I can't explain it better than that. The second night had been worse. The thing had gotten bolder, moving closer to their camp. James Patterson, a quiet guy who'd barely said a word since I arrived, told me he'd seen eyes reflecting red light about 50 yards out in the forest. Bear eyes reflect yellow or green, he said. These were red, jade red, like brake lights. I'd been taking notes through all of this, but that detail made me stop writing. In all my years in these mountains, I'd never heard of any animal with red. Eyeshine, deer, raccoons, bears, coyotes. They all reflected different colors, but never red. Did anyone else see the eyes? I asked. 3 of the 6 men nodded. Carl Rodriguez added, the thing that really got to us was how high up they were. Had to be 7 feet off the ground, maybe more. I was about to ask another question when we heard it. A sound from the forest that made every man in that clearing freeze like rabbits, sensing a hawk overhead. It was breathing, just like they'd described. Heavy, rhythmic, but with an odd quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. It sounded almost human, but too deep, too controlled, like something that had learned how to breathe by watching people do it. The sound was coming from the north side of the clearing, maybe 40 yards into the trees. I pulled out my binoculars and scanned the tree line, looking for movement or a shape that didn't belong. "There," whispered Dave Kim, pointing to a cluster of pine trees. "Do you see it?" I focused my binoculars where he was pointing and felt my heart skip. Something was standing between two large pines, mostly hidden in shadow. I could make out a dark shape, taller than a man, broader than any bear I'd ever seen. As I watched, it moved slightly, and I caught a glimpse of an arm that looked too long for the body it was attached to. "Nobody move," I said quietly, still watching through the binoculars. "Nobody make any sudden sounds." For maybe 30 seconds, we all stood perfectly still. The breathing continued, steady and patient. Then, without any warning, the shape simply vanished. One moment it was there, the next moment the space between the trees was empty. "Where did it go?" Carl asked. I lowered the binoculars and scanned the forest with my naked eyes. Nothing. It was like the thing had just dissolved into the shadows. "I don't know," I said, and meant it. That's when we found Mike Stevens. Dave Kim was the one who noticed Mike was missing. We'd all been so focused on the thing in the trees that nobody had kept track of the group. Mike had been standing right behind me when the breathing started. Now, he was gone. "Mike!" Carl called out. "Mike, where are you?" We spread out and searched the clearing, calling Mike's name. James Patterson found his rifle leaning against a tree about 20 yards from where he'd been standing. The safety was still on, and there was a full round in the chamber. Mike hadn't even tried to defend himself. I was reaching for my radio to call for backup when Dave Kim's voice cut through the air like a scream. "Over here! Oh God, over here!" We found Mike Stevens at the base of Rough Ridge Trail, about 100 yards from camp. What we found wasn't something I want to describe in detail, but I have to, because it's important for understanding what we were dealing with. Mike had been torn apart with surgical precision. His chest was open clean, like someone had used a scalpel instead of claws. His internal organs were missing, removed so carefully that there was less blood than you'd expect. The wounds were too clean, too deliberate. This wasn't the work of any animal I knew about. But the worst part was Mike's face. His eyes were wide open, staring up at the sky, and his expression was one of complete terror. Whatever had killed him, he'd seen it coming. He'd watched it happen. I radioed for backup and the county coroner, then set up a perimeter around the body. The other hunters were in shock, some crying, some just standing there staring. I'd seen plenty of animal attacks in my career, but this was different. This was wrong in ways that made my ranger training feel useless. While we waited for help to arrive, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The snow around Mike's body was melted in a perfect X-circle, about 10 feet across. The temperature was still below freezing, but the ground was warm to the touch. Whatever had killed Mike Stevens had left heat behind, like a signature, as I knelt there beside the body, looking at wounds that shouldn't exist. I realized that everything I thought I knew about these mountains was about to change. The beast of Bloedenboro wasn't just a story anymore. It was here, in my forest, and it had just announced itself with blood. The county coroner arrived 3 hours later, followed by State Wildlife Officer Bill Morrison. Bill was a good man, 20 years on the job, and he'd seen his share of animal attacks. But when he examined Mike Stevens' body, I watched his face go pale. "Patty," he said, pulling me aside, "what kind of bite radius are we looking at here?" I showed him the measurements I'd taken. The spacing between the puncture wounds suggested a jaw that opened wider than any known predator in North Carolina. "Could be a really big dog," Bill said, but he didn't sound convinced. Maybe someone's keeping an illegal exotic pet that got loose. The coroner's preliminary findings made even less sense. The claw marks suggested something with opposable thumbs, the kind of grip control you only see in primates. But the bite patterns and the sheer strength required to cause this damage pointed to something much larger and more powerful. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, the coroner told me. "I've never seen anything like this. The precision is almost surgical." While the officials processed the scene, I talked to the remaining hunters about what happened next. Carl Rodriguez wanted to pack up and leave immediately. but I convinced them to stay one more night. Whatever had killed Mike was still out there, and splitting up would just give it more targets. "We stick together," I said. "Nobody goes anywhere alone, not even to answer nature's call. We build up the fire, keep it burning all night, and wait for morning." Bill Morrison agreed to stay with us. He had a heavy caliber rifle and enough experience to be useful in a crisis. What we didn't know was that experience doesn't matter when you're dealing with something that shouldn't exist. Around sunset, we started finding the deer carcasses. James Patterson spotted the first one about 50 yards north of our camp. It was a full-grown doe, killed recently, with the same surgical wounds we'd seen on Mike Stevens. But this deer had been positioned deliberately, placed where we couldn't miss seeing it. Over the next hour, we found 5 more deer arranged in a perfect circle around our campsite. Each one was killed the same way, each one positioned like a warning or a taunt. Whatever we were dealing with wasn't just hunting for food, it was playing with us. "This is territorial behavior," Bill said, studying the pattern of carcasses through binoculars. "It's marking its hunting ground, telling us we don't belong here." "Bears don't do this," Carl said. His voice was shaking. "Bears don't arrange dead animals in patterns." I had to agree. In 14 years of dealing with problem bears, I'd never seen anything like this level of intelligence and planning. This was predator behavior beyond anything in my training manual. As darkness fell, we built up our fire until it was more like a bonfire. The flames threw light about 30 yards in every direction, creating a circle of safety in the black forest. We arranged ourselves around the fire with our backs to each other, rifles ready, eyes scanning the tree line. The breathing started again around 9 p.m. This time it was closer, maybe 20 yards out. And it wasn't just coming from one direction. The sound seemed to move around our camp in a slow circle, like the thing was testing our defenses. Every few minutes it would stop for 30 seconds or so, then resume from a different position. "It's learning our pattern," Bill whispered, "figuring out how we react." Around at 10 p.m., the rock throwing started. The first stone landed right at the edge of our firelight with a heavy thud, then another and another. Not random throws. These rocks were being placed deliberately, testing how close the thing could get before we responded. "Should we shoot?" Dave Kim asked, his rifle trained on the darkness. "At what?" I replied. "We can't see anything to aim at." That's when we heard Dave's voice calling from the forest. "Hey guys, I found something over here. Come look at this." We all turned to look at Dave Kim, who was sitting right next to me by the fire, his face white with terror. "That's not me," he whispered. The voice came again, identical to Dave's voice in every way. "Come on, guys. It's really important. You need to see this." Bill Morrison stood up slowly, his rifle ready. "Whatever you are," he called out, "we know you're not Dave. Show yourself." The response came in Carl Rodriguez's voice. "Patty, I'm hurt over here. I need help. Please come help me." Carl grabbed my arm. "That thing is copying us," he said. "How is it copying our voices?" Before I could answer, we heard Mike Stevens calling from the forest. Mike Stevens, who was dead. Mike Stevens, whose body was still under a tarp, waiting for transport. "Guys, where did everyone go? I can't find the camp. Help me find my way back." That broke James Patterson. He jumped up and started running toward the voice, shouting Mike's name. Bill Morrison tackled him before he made it past the firelight. "That's not Mike," Bill shouted, holding James down. "Mike is dead. Don't listen to it." The voices continued for another hour, cycling through all of our names, calling us with perfect imitations of each other's speech patterns. Sometimes it was someone asking for help, sometimes someone claiming to have found something important, sometimes someone just calling our names over and over. The worst part was that the voices were always coming from just beyond the edge of our vision, just far enough away that we couldn't be sure they weren't real. Around midnight, Bill Moriso and made his fatal mistake. He'd brought a tranquilizer gun along with his rifle, and he decided to try a different approach. "I'm going to dart this thing," he announced. "Whatever it is, if I can knock it unconscious, we can get some answers." Don't leave the fire, I warned him. I'm not going far, Bill said. Just to that tree line there, maybe 15 yards. You guys keep me covered. Bill loaded the tranquilizer dart and moved toward the north side of our camp, staying in the firelight as much as possible. He made it about 10 yards before the attack. I never saw the creature move in. 1 second Bill was walking toward the trees. The next second he was flying through the air like he'd been hit by a truck. He landed hard against a pine tree 20 feet away, and I heard the wet snap of his neck breaking. The thing that killed him was gone before any of us could get a clear look at it. All I saw was a dark shape, massive and impossibly fast, disappearing into the forest like smoke. When we reached Bill Morrison, he was dead. His neck had been twisted completely around, but there were no claw marks, no bite wounds. Whatever had killed him had done it with pure strength, like snapping a twig. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with just an animal. We were dealing with something that combined animal power with human-level intelligence, something that could plan, adapt, and use psychological warfare against its prey. And we were trapped in the mountains with it, with no way to call for help and nowhere to run. With Bill Morrison dead and the creature getting bolder, I made the decision to move the surviving hunters to higher ground. There was a granite cave system about half a mile up Rough Ridge Trail that would give us shelter and limit the angles of attack. We can't stay in the open, I told the group. Whatever this thing is, it's hunting us systematically. Our best chance is to find a defendable position and wait for sunrise. Carl Rodriguez looked at me like I was crazy. You want us to go into a cave? What if it traps us in there? It's already trapping us, I said. At least in the caves, it can't circle around us. The hike up to the cave system was the longest half-mile of my life. We moved in single file, staying close together with our flashlights sweeping the trees on both sides of the trail. Every shadow looked like it might contain something with red eyes and impossible strength. The breathing followed us the entire way, staying just at the edge of our hearing. Sometimes it seemed to come from ahead of us on the trail, sometimes from behind. The thing was pacing us, staying close enough to attack if one of us fell behind or made a mistake. About halfway up the ridge, James Patterson collapsed. The stress and fear had finally gotten to him, and he just sat down in the snow and refused to go any further. I can't do this, he said, tears streaming down his face. It's going to kill us all anyway. What's the point? Dave Kim and I got on either side of James and helped him to his feet. Nobody's dying on my watch, I said. We stick together. We make it through the night. But even as I said it, I could feel the creature watching us from the darkness. It was patient, intelligent, waiting for the right moment to strike. And we were giving it plenty of opportunities. The cave entrance was a narrow opening in the granite face, just wide enough for one person at a time. I sent the hunters in first, then followed with our gear and what was left of our supplies. The cave opened up into a larger chamber about 20 feet across, with several smaller tunnels leading deeper into the mountain. As I set up a battery-powered lantern in the center of the chamber, the light revealed something that made my heart stop. The walls were covered with paintings, not modern graffiti or tourist carvings, but ancient artwork painted directly on the rock. The images showed figures that looked human in some ways, animal in others. And in the center of the largest wall was a creature I recognized immediately. It stood upright like a man, but it had the massive shoulders and elongated arms of a bear. Its face was a horrible blend of human and animal features, with eyes that seemed to stare right out of the rock. Surrounding this central figure were smaller human forms, some fleeing, some lying motionless on the ground. "Cherokee," said a voice from the cave entrance. We all spun around, weapons ready, but it was just an old man in traditional native clothing. He was small and weathered, maybe 70 years old, with long gray hair and kind eyes that had seen too much. "How did you find us?" Carl demanded, his rifle trained on the newcomer. The old man held up his hands. "My name is Thomas Barefoot. I live on the reservation about 10 miles from here. I heard about the deaths on the radio, and I knew what was happening." "What do you mean you knew?" I asked. Thomas pointed to the cave paintings. "This creature, we call it Kekla Kudla, the cursed hunter. Your people might know it as the Beast of Bladenborough, but it's much older than that name. He walked over to the largest painting and placed his hand on the rock. Long ago, before the Trail of Tears, there was a Cherokee shaman who broke the sacred laws of the hunt. He killed for pleasure instead of need, and he used dark magic to make himself stronger and faster than any normal man. That's just a legend, Dave Kim said, but his voice was shaking. Thomas looked at him with eyes that were infinitely sad. The spirits cursed him to hunt forever, never satisfied, never able to rest. Every 15 or 20 years, when the hunger grows too strong, he wakes up and kills until the bloodlust passes. You're telling us we're dealing with some kind of supernatural creature? Carl asked. A cursed Indian shaman from 100 years ago. Not 100 years, Thomas said quietly. More like 200. And yes, that's exactly what I'm telling you. As if summoned by our conversation, the breathing started again. This time, it was coming from right outside the cave entrance. It's found us, James whispered. Thomas nodded. Kekla Kudla can track human scent across great distances. It knows fear smell, and it always targets the most frightened first. The breathing got closer, and we heard the scrape of claws against rock. The creature was right outside, testing the cave entrance. What do we do? I asked Thomas. How do we fight something like this? You don't fight it, Thomas said. You appease it. He explained that according to Cherokee tradition, Kekle Kudla could be satisfied with a proper offering, a fresh kill presented according to the old hunting protocols. If the creature accepted the offering, it would retreat until its hunger woke again. One of us has to go out there, Thomas said. One of us has to make the offering. Carl Rodriguez looked around the cave at the terrified faces of his hunting party. I'll do it, he said quietly. This whole trip was my idea. These guys came up here because I asked them to. If someone has to die, it should be me. Carl, no, Dave Kim said. We'll find another way. But Carl was already checking his rifle and moving toward the cave entrance. You take care of your families, he said. And if you make it out of here, tell mine what happened. Tell them I didn't go down without a fight. Before any of us could stop him, Carl stepped out of the cave and into the darkness. The attack was over in seconds. We heard Carl scream once, a sound that cut off abruptly. Then silence. But the silence held. The breathing stopped. The scraping of claws against rock stopped. Whatever had been stalking us for 3 days was gone. Thomas pulled out a small leather pouch and scattered tobacco leaves at the cave entrance, speaking in Cherokee in a low, rhythmic voice. It's done, he said after a few minutes. Kekle Kudla has accepted the offering. He'll sleep now for a while. We found Carl's body at dawn about 50 yards from the cave entrance. Like Mike Stevens, he'd been killed with surgical precision, but there was something different about his positioning. Instead of being torn apart in rage, Carl's body was arranged respectfully, almost ceremonially. The creature honored his sacrifice, Thomas explained. Carl offered himself according to the old ways, and Kekle Kudla recognized that spiritual authority. The rescue teams found us around noon. Dave Kim and James Patterson were both in shock, barely able to speak coherently. The official report listed the deaths as animal attack by unusually aggressive bear, and the area was temporarily closed to hunting. All of our photographs and evidence were confiscated by state authorities. The coroner's report was sealed. As far as the outside world was concerned, 3 men had died in a tragic but explainable encounter with North Carolina wildlife. But I knew the truth, and the truth changed everything. I developed chronic insomnia after that November. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw red eyes staring at me from the darkness. I jumped at sudden noises, couldn't be alone in the forest after dark, and found myself checking and rechecking locks on doors and windows. My son noticed the change immediately. I went from being the mom who took him camping every weekend to someone who could barely function around trees. Our relationship never recovered from my inability to explain what had happened to me in those mountains. I transferred to a desk job in Asheville within 6 months, officially citing a knee injury from the incident. Unofficially, I couldn't handle being in the field anymore. The forests that had been my home for 36 years now felt like enemy territory. but I couldn't let it go completely. I started researching Cherokee transformation legends, collecting stories from tribal elders about creatures that lived in the space between human and animal. I found similar incidents scattered across the Appalachian Range, unexplained deaths, every 15 to 20 years that followed the same pattern we'd experienced. I maintain informal contact with other rangers throughout the Blue Ridge, sharing coded warnings about problem bear areas when the timing feels right. Most of them think I'm just being overly cautious, but a few understand. They've had their own encounters with things that don't fit in any wildlife manual. Dave Kim moved to Florida 6 months after the incident. He lasted 2 years before taking his own life, leaving behind a note that mentioned red eyes in the darkness. James Patterson still lives in Charlotte, but he hasn't been camping since 1983. Sometimes he calls me late at night when he can't sleep, and we talk about anything except what we saw in those mountains. Thomas Barefoot taught me the protective rituals before he died in 1987. Every November, when the anniversary rolls around, I drive back up to Grandfather Mountain and leave tobacco offerings at the cave entrance. It's probably superstition, but I've never seen another incident in that area since Carl Rodriguez made his sacrifice. The thing is, I know Kekle Kudla is still up there. Sometimes when I'm driving the Blue Ridge Parkway on foggy nights, I catch glimpses of something too large and too wrong moving through the trees alongside my car. It never approaches, never threatens, but it's watching. Always watching. I'm 58 now, close to retirement. My official record shows a distinguished career with over 300 successful rescues and 0 casualties under my command. The Beast of Blue Ridge incident doesn't appear anywhere in my personnel file, but every November I get calls from rangers in other districts, reports of unusual animal behavior, impossible tracks in the snow, hunters who've seen things they can't explain. The hunger wakes up every 15 or 20 years, just like Thomas said it would. And when those calls come in, I pack my truck with tobacco and drive into the mountains to do what I can to keep the old bargains intact. Because I've learned that some truths are too dangerous to ignore, and some responsibilities never end. The Beast of Blue Ridge is real. It's still out there, and sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I think it remembers me too. Patricia Patty Thornfield retired from the U.S. Forest Service in 2001. She currently lives in Asheville, North Carolina, where she works part-time as a wilderness survival instructor. She has never spoken publicly about the events of November 1983 and requests that anyone experiencing similar incidents contact her through the Blue Ridge Mountain Rangers Association. My name is Douglas McLeod, and I've been a park ranger for 16 years. Most folks just call me Doug. I work in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia, and I know these mountains like the back of my hand. Every trail, every cliff, every dangerous spot where weekend hikers get themselves into trouble. I'm 41 now, been climbing rocks since I got back from Korea. The war left me with some things I'd rather not think about, and hanging off a cliff face helps clear my head. Makes the nightmares fade, at least for a while. My job lets me teach climbing to visitors, and I do search and rescue when people get stuck or hurt. Seneca Rocks is my specialty. It's this massive limestone cliff that shoots straight up 900 feet from the valley floor. Ancient ocean bottom, pushed up when the world was young. I've climbed every route on those rocks, all 35 of them. Some are easy walks. Others will kill you if you're not careful. October 1969 was perfect climbing weather. Clear skies, cool air, leaves turning gold and red all through the valley. The rocks were dry and solid, perfect grip for your hands and feet. Climbers came from all over the East Coast that weekend. Virginia Tech had sent up a group of their best students. That's when the radio started acting funny. I was in my ranger station that morning checking weather reports when static filled the airwaves. Not unusual in the mountains. Sometimes the rocks mess with signals. But this was different. My radio would work fine until I got within maybe 50 yards of the cliff face. Then it died completely. My compass was going crazy too. Instead of pointing north, the needle kept swinging toward the rocks themselves like there was some kind of magnet buried inside all that limestone. I should have paid more attention to those signs. The Virginia Tech kids had gone out early that morning to Keel and the North Peak route. Three of them, Mark Chen, Lisa Park, and Kevin Walsh. All experienced climbers, all carrying the right gear. They were supposed to check in every 2 hours. By noon, I hadn't heard from them. By 2 o'clock, I was worried. By 4, I was grabbing my rescue gear and heading up the mountain. The North Peak route isn't the hardest climb on Seneca Rocks, but it's no joke either. Lots of places where a mistake can kill you. I've pulled more than one body off those rocks over the years. Usually it's someone who thought they were better than they were. But these kids knew what they were doing. I'd checked their gear myself that morning. Good ropes, proper protection, plenty of water. They should have been fine. The first sign something was wrong came when I found their rope. It was hanging about 200 feet up the cliff, swaying in the breeze. But it wasn't broken or frayed like you'd expect from a fall. It was cut, clean as a knife through butter. Both ends looked like someone had taken a razor blade to them. That's impossible on a rock face. What could cut climbing rope like that? I started climbing, following their route. My hands knew every hold, every crack in the stone. But something felt different. The rock seemed colder than it should be, and there was a sound. At first I thought it was wind whistling through the limestone caves. These mountains are full of holes and tunnels carved by water over millions of years. But as I climbed higher, I realized it wasn't wind at all. Someone was singing. The sound came from inside the rock itself, soft and low, like voices humming a song I'd never heard before. It made my skin crawl, but I kept climbing. Those kids needed help. That's when I found Mark Chen. Mark was wedged in a crack about 200 feet up the cliff face. At first I thought he was just stuck. It happens sometimes when climb. Bears try to squeeze through tight spots. But when I reached him, I knew something was terribly wrong. He was dead, but not in any way that made sense. Mark looked like he'd been lying in the Sindena, desert sun, for weeks. His skin was dry and papery, his lips cracked and white. But he'd only been climbing since morning. It was barely past 4 in the afternoon. I checked his body carefully. No broken bones, no cuts, no signs he'd fallen or been hurt. He just looked old, dried out. His climbing clothes were faded too, like they'd been left in the sun for years. The singing was louder here. It seemed to come from the crack where Mark's body was stuck. When I pressed my ear to the limestone, I could hear it clearly, voices singing in words I didn't understand. My radio was completely dead now. I tried to call for backup, but nothing. Even my flashlight wouldn't work. The batteries were brand new that morning, but they were drained completely. I had to keep looking for the other 2 students. I climbed down and started searching the base of the cliff. That's where I found Lisa Park. She was sitting against a boulder, alive but not really there. Her eyes were rolled back in her head, showing only white. Her lips were moving, but she wasn't speaking English. The sounds coming out of her mouth were strange, clicking and hissing like no language I'd ever heard. I tried to wake her up, but she didn't respond. Her pulse was weak and fast. She looked like someone who'd been lost in the desert for days, but she'd only been gone since morning. I got some water from my pack and tried to get her to drink. She swallowed a little, but kept making those strange sounds. It almost sounded like she was warning me about something. Kevin Walsh was nowhere to be found. I spent the rest of the daylight searching every ledge and crack I could reach. Nothing. But I did find his gear, rope, helmet, and climbing hardware, sitting on a ledge 400 feet up the cliff face. The problem was, there's no way to climb to that ledge. I've been on these rocks for years, and I know every possible route. What Kevin's gear was sitting on was a completely smooth overhang with no handholds or cracks. No human could climb up there, not even with ropes. But somehow his equipment had gotten there. As the sun went down, I made camp at the base of the cliff. Lisa Park was still mumbling in that strange language, but she seemed stable enough. I wrapped her in my sleeping bag and built a fire. That's when things got really strange. After midnight, the limestone cliff began to glow. Not bright, just a soft blue light that seemed to come from inside the rock itself. And the singing got louder. Much louder. Now I could make out individual voices, men and women singing together in harmony. But the sound was coming from inside solid stone. I'd heard stories about these mountains, old Seneca Indian legends about spirits that lived in the rocks. But I'm a practical man. I studied geology in college. I know rocks don't glow, and they don't sing. But I was seeing it with my own eyes. Lisa suddenly stopped mumbling and looked right at me. For a moment, her eyes were normal again. "Don't let them take you into the stone," she whispered in perfect English. "The spirits need fresh souls to guard the deep places." Then her eyes rolled back again, and she went back to making those clicking sounds. I radioed for help, forgetting my radio was dead. When I picked up the handset, though, it crackled to life. Tom Bradley, another ranger, answered immediately. "Doug, where the hell are you? I've been trying to reach you for hours." "Seneca Rocks," I said. "I need backup. We've got missing climbers and—" I looked at the glowing cliff face. "Just get up here, Tom, and bring medical supplies." "On my way." The radio died again as soon as I signed off. The rest of the night, I sat by the fire watching the rocks glow and listening to voices sing from inside solid limestone. Lisa Park kept mumbling warnings in that strange language, and somewhere up on that impossible ledge, Kevin Walsh's gear waited in the dark. By morning, I was starting to think I was losing my mind. Then Tom arrived, and I realized I wasn't crazy at all. I was just in way over my head. Tom Bradley showed up at sunrise with a full medical kit and enough climbing gear for both of us. He took one look at Lisa Park and started checking her vital signs. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, shining a light in her eyes. "Since yesterday afternoon. She keeps mumbling in some weird language." Tom listened to her for a minute, frowning. "Doug, this sounds like Seneca. Old Seneca dialect. Where would a college kid from Virginia learn to speak ancient Seneca?" I pointed up at the cliff face. In daylight, it looked normal again, just gray limestone rising into the morning sky. She said something about spirits in the rocks, about fresh souls guarding deep places. Tom followed my gaze upward. "Show me where you found the other two." We started climbing together, Tom carrying the medical supplies while I led the route. I showed him the cut rope still hanging where I'd found it. Then we climbed to the crack where Mark Chen's body was wedged. Tom examined the body carefully. He'd been a medic in Vietnam, so he knew what death looked like. After a few minutes, he sat back on his heels and shook his head. "This doesn't make sense, Doug. This kid looks like he's been dead for weeks, completely dehydrated. But you said he went climbing yesterday morning." "That's right. And look at this." I showed Tom my watch. It was reading 7:30 a.m. Then I showed him Tom's watch. It said 6:45 a.m. "Our watches don't match," I said. "And look at the shadows." The shadows from the rocks were falling the wrong way. In the morning, they should point west. These were pointing east, like the sun was setting instead of rising. Tom stared at the shadows, then at his watch. "What the hell is going on here?" That's when we heard Kevin Walsh calling for help. His voice came from above us, somewhere, up on the cliff face. But when we looked up, we couldn't see him anywhere. "Help me!" Kevin's voice echoed off the rocks. "I can't get down. Something's wrong with the rock." Tom and I looked at each other. Kevin's voice was coming from the direction of that impossible ledge where we'd found his gear. "We have to try to reach him," Tom said. I knew it was crazy, but we started climbing toward Kevin's voice. The route took us up the hardest part of the north face. Vertical rock with tiny handholds and no room for mistakes. As we climbed higher, strange things started happening. My hands would reach for holds that looked solid, but my fingers would sink right into the limestone like it was soft clay. Then the rock would harden again, trapping my fingers until I could wiggle them free. Tom's climbing rope started moving by itself, not swaying in the wind, actually crawling along the rock face like a snake. When he tried to grab it, it slithered away from his hands. And the singing started again. Louder now, coming from all around us. Voices in harmony, singing words that made my bones ache. "Doug," Tom called down to me, "look at the rock." I looked at the limestone next to my face and nearly fell off the cliff. There were shapes moving inside the stone. Human shapes, walking around inside solid rock like it was air. Men and women in old-fashioned clothes, some carrying tools or weapons I didn't recognize. They looked like they were trying to tell us something. One of the figures, an old man with long gray hair, pressed his hands against the inside surface of the rock. His mouth was moving like he was shouting, but I could only hear the singing. Then I realized the singing was coming from these people, the spirits trapped inside the limestone. "Tom!" I yelled. "Don't touch the rock!" But it was too late. Tom had grabbed what looked like a solid handhold, but his fingers sank into the limestone. He tried to pull back, but the rock held on. As I watched in horror, his hand disappeared into the stone up to the wrist. "I can't get free," Tom shouted. "It's pulling me in." I climbed up as fast as I could, but the rock around Tom was changing. It looked like water now, rippling and moving. Tom's arm was sinking deeper into the cliff face. "Fight it!" I yelled. "Don't let it take you!" But Tom's eyes were getting glassy. His voice changed, becoming deeper and older. "The barriers must be maintained," he said in a voice that wasn't his own. "The deep ones must not rise. Fresh souls are needed for the watch." Then his other hand sank into the rock, and Tom was trapped up to his shoulders in solid limestone. But he was still talking, or something was talking through him. "The Seneca knew," Tom's voice said, but he was speaking with the accent of an old man. "They built the barriers when the world was young. We guard the deep places. We keep the ancient hunger sleeping." I grabbed Tom's shoulders and tried to pull him free, but the rock held him tight. "Listen, Ranger," the voice continued. "Your people dig too deep now. Mines and tunnels disturb the old seals. The deep ones stir in their prison. We need new guardians." "Let him go!" I shouted at the cliff face. Multiple voices answered me, Tom's voice mixed with dozens of others. "One must stay to guard. One must stay to watch. But we will bargain with you, Stone Climber. We will trade." That's when I saw Kevin Walsh. He was standing inside the rock, clearly visible through the translucent limestone. He looked normal, not dried up like Mark Chen. He was moving around like he was walking on solid ground, but I could see right through the rock to where he stood. Kevin saw me and pressed his hands against the inside surface of the stone. His mouth was moving, and slowly his voice joined the chorus of singing. "Doug!" Kevin's voice came through the rock. "I chose to stay. Someone has to guard the deep places. There are things down there that can't be allowed to escape." I stared at him through the stone. "What things?" "Older than the mountains," Kevin answered. "Hungry things from before humans walked the earth. The Seneca trapped them in the deep caves and sealed them with spirit guardians. But the seals are weakening." Tom's body was almost completely inside the rock now, only his head still visible. But he was still conscious, still talking. "The choice is yours, Doug McLeod," Tom said with that old man's voice. "Join us willingly, and your friend goes free. Refuse, and he becomes a guardian forever. But either way, the barriers must be maintained." I looked at Kevin inside the rock, at Tom trapped in the stone, at the glowing figures of ancient guardians all around me, and I made my choice. "Wait!" I called out to the spirits. "There has to be another way." The singing stopped. For a moment, the only sound was wind whistling through the peaks around us. Tom's head was still visible in the rock, but his eyes were closed now. "Speak your terms, Stone Climber," came the old man's voice through Tom's lips. I thought fast. These spirits had been guarding something for centuries, maybe longer. They were tired, and they needed help. But they also seemed to respect the old ways, bargains and trades instead of just taking what they wanted. "I know these mountains better than any man alive," I said. "I can help keep people away from dangerous places. I can make sure no one disturbs whatever you're guarding down there. But I need my friend back, and I need Kevin to be able to choose freely." The rock around Tom started to ripple again. I could see the spirits inside the stone talking among themselves, their mouths moving silently. Finally, the old man's voice answered. "You would serve willingly, knowing the cost?" "What cost?" Kevin's voice joined the conversation. "You'd see things, Doug. dreams and visions of what's sealed below. You'd know when the barriers are weakening, and sometimes you'd have to do things to keep people safe, things they wouldn't understand. I thought about Mark Chen, dried up like an ancient mummy, about Lisa Park, mumbling warnings in a language she'd never learned, about all the climbers who might come after them. If I agree, you let Tom go, and Kevin gets to choose whether to stay or come back? The barriers require guardians, the old voice said. But guardianship can take many forms. Your friend may return to the world above, but he will carry our mark. He will remember what he has seen, and the young one may choose, guardian of the deep places or guardian of the high. Kevin stepped forward inside the rock until he was right next to the surface. I choose to stay, Doug. Someone needs to watch from inside, but Tom should go back. He's got a family. I nodded. Then I agree. I'll serve as guardian of the high places. I'll keep people away from the dangerous spots. I'll protect your barriers. The singing started again, but softer now, more like a lullaby than a war chant. The rock around Tom began to change, becoming liquid again. Slowly his body emerged from the limestone. As soon as he was free, I grabbed him and pulled him away from the cliff face. Tom was breathing, but unconscious. His hair had gone completely gray, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there an hour ago. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. Inside the rock, Kevin raised his hand in goodbye. "Tell my family I'm okay," he said. "Tell them I'm doing something important." Then the stone became solid again, and Kevin was gone. But I could still see him if I looked carefully. He was there inside the limestone, along with dozens of other spirits, all of them keeping watch over whatever was sealed in the deep caves below. The old man's voice spoke to me one more time, but now it came from inside my own head. "You will know what to do, Douglas MacLeod. The knowledge will come when needed. Guard the high places well." Suddenly, I understood things I'd never known before. I could see the network of caves and tunnels that ran deep underground. I could sense the old barriers that kept something ancient and hungry locked away. And I knew that these barriers needed constant tending, like a fire that must never be allowed to die. I also knew exactly how to get Tom and myself down from the cliff safely. By the time we reached the bottom, Tom was awake but confused. Lisa Park was sitting up, looking normal for the first time since I'd found her. "What happened?" Tom asked. I remember climbing and then... nothing. I helped him to his feet. "You had an accident. Hit your head on the rock. We need to get you both to a hospital." Lisa looked at me with clear eyes. "You made a deal with them, didn't you?" I nodded. "Someone had to." She stood up slowly. "I remember being inside the stone. I remember the guardians teaching me their language so I could warn you. They're not evil, you know. They're heroes. They've been protecting the world for longer than we can imagine." Tom was checking his reflection in his water bottle. "Why is my hair gray? What the hell happened up there?" "Some things are better left unknown," I told him. "Trust me on that." We gathered our gear and started hiking back toward the ranger station. I would report Mark Chen's death as a climbing accident. Kevin Walsh would be listed as missing, presumed fallen. Lisa Park would recover from her dehydration and exposure, but I would know the truth, and I would carry the responsibility that came with it. As we walked away from Seneca Rocks, I could still hear the faint sound of singing carried on the wind. The guardians were at their posts, watching and waiting. And now, I was one of them. That was 15 years ago now. Tom Bradley transferred to a different Forest Service region within a month. Said the mountains were getting to him, making him feel claustrophobic. He learned to speak Seneca fluently, though he claims he doesn't remember how. He sends me letters sometimes, never mentions what happened on the rocks, but he'll include newspaper clippings about cave-ins at mining operations or archaeological digs that got abandoned for safety reasons. He knows things now, just like I do. We both carry the mark of the guardians. Lisa Park finished college and became a professor of Native American Studies. She specializes in Seneca spiritual traditions. We've talked a few times over the years. She remembers everything, the spirits, the warnings, the ancient barriers. She helps in her own way, writing papers that encourage respect for sacred sites and indigenous knowledge. Kevin Walsh's family held a memorial service 6 months after he disappeared. I attended and told them he died doing something brave and important. His mother asked if I thought he was at peace. I told her yes, which was the truth. When I visit Seneca Rocks at night, I can sometimes see Kevin inside the stone standing watch with the other guardians. He looks content. As for me, I've kept my bargain. I monitor every climbing permit for the area. When someone applies to climb the more dangerous routes, especially the ones near the spiritual hotspots, I find reasons to discourage them. Equipment concerns, weather warnings, wildlife activity. Whatever works. Most climbers just go somewhere else. But a few get pushy, demanding to know why certain routes are off limits. Those are the ones I have to watch carefully. The barriers call to some people, especially those with anger or greed in their hearts. The ancient hunger below recognizes kindred spirits. I've had to be creative over the years. Sometimes I arrange for climbing gear to malfunction at just the right moment. Sometimes rangers accidentally discover rare bird nests that require temporary area closures. Once I convinced the Forestry Service that limestone in certain areas was geologically unstable. The knowledge helps. Ever since that day on the rocks, I've understood things about these mountains that no textbook ever taught me. I can sense when the barriers are under stress. I can feel when something down in the deep caves is stirring restlessly. And I dream about them sometimes. The things that the Seneca locked away centuries ago. Ancient things that fed on human fear and pain. Things that would have consumed every living soul in North America if they'd been allowed to roam free. The dreams aren't pleasant, but they serve a purpose. They remind me why my job matters. 3 times in 15 years, the deep barriers have started to weaken. Mining operations getting too close to the sealed caves or construction projects digging where they shouldn't. Each time, I've had to intervene. A word to the right environmental group here, an anonymous tip about archaeological significance there. Once, I had to arrange for a small landslide to block access to a particularly dangerous excavation. People think I'm just a paranoid old ranger who's gotten too attached to his territory. They don't understand that I'm protecting them from things their nightmares couldn't imagine. The guardians inside the stone help when they can. Sometimes climbers report seeing figures in the rock. Translucent people who gesture warnings or point towards safer routes. Most folks dismiss these as hallucinations caused by altitude or stress. I encourage that explanation. But experienced climbers, the ones who really know these mountains, have learned to pay attention to the spirits. They call it reading the rock. And they'll tell you that Seneca Rocks will warn you if you're going somewhere you shouldn't. They're right, though they don't know how right they are. I'm 56 now, and I can't climb like I used to. My knees ache in cold weather, and I get winded easier than I once did. But the spiritual connection has grown stronger over the years. I can feel the pulse of the barriers, even when I'm miles away. I know when they need tending. The Park Service will force me to retire in a few years. When that happens, I'll need to train a replacement, someone who can take over the guardian duties. The spirits have been showing me candidates in dreams, young rangers and geologists who have the right combination of respect for nature and strength of will. It won't be easy to explain. How do you tell someone that their job involves keeping ancient horrors locked underground? How do you make them understand that some mountains are sacred barriers, not recreational challenges? But I'll find a way. The guardians have been patient teachers, and I've learned that the right person will understand when they're ready. Until then, I keep watch. I patrol the climbing routes and monitor the permits. I maintain my cover story about geological instability and wildlife preservation. I perform the monthly rituals the spirits taught me, offerings of tobacco and traditional prayers at specific points around the mountain. And at night, when the limestone glows softly blue and the ancient songs drift from within the stone, I stand witness with Kevin Walsh and the other guardians. We watch over the deep places where hungry darkness waits. Some people think park rangers just check permits and give directions to lost hikers. They don't understand that we're often the only thing standing between civilization and the wild, dangerous forces that shaped this continent long before humans arrived. Most rangers guard against avalanches and forest fires. I guard against something much worse. The singing stones of Seneca Rocks still call out their ancient warnings to those who know how to listen, and as long as I draw breath, I'll make sure those warnings are heeded, because some barriers must never be allowed to fall, and some guardians never get to rest. My name is Samuel Whitehorse, but everyone calls me Sam. I've been a ranger at Cherokee National Forest for 12 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains had to offer. Bears, wildcats, lost hikers, illegal hunters, you name it. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened in Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest during the winter of 1977. I'm half Cherokee on my mother's side. My grandfather was a medicine man back on the reservation, and he used to tell me stories about the old ways, stories about spirits and sacred places. I listened politely as a kid, but honestly, I figured most of it was just old folklore mixed up with too much corn whiskey. The forest was my job, not my religion. Joyce Kilmer. Forest sits deep in the heart of our territory, 400-year-old trees that have never felt an axe. The Cherokee consider it sacred ground, and I can understand why. When you walk through those ancient giants, everything goes quiet. The air feels thick, almost alive. On foggy mornings, which we get a lot of in December, it's like stepping into another world entirely. That particular winter was strange from the start. December should have been cold and bitter, but we were getting these warm spells that made thick fog roll through the forest like smoke. The old-timers said it reminded them of ghost weather, the kind that comes when the spirit world gets restless. I was sitting in my office on December 15th when the phone rang. Pete Morrison, foreman for the construction crew building the new trail access road, sounded rattled. "Sam, we got problems up here," he said. "Someone's been messing with our equipment, third time this week." "What kind of messing?" I asked, already reaching for my keys. "Chainsaws jammed up with rocks, bulldozer tires slashed. And get this, yesterday morning, all our surveying stakes had been pulled up and arranged in a kind of circle. Real neat-like, almost ceremonial." I drove out to the construction site, about 2 miles into the forest on an old logging road. Pete met me at the gate, and I could see he was spooked. This was a guy who'd been building roads for 20 years, but his hands were shaking when he lit his cigarette. "Started 3 days ago," he explained as we walked toward the work area. "Monday morning we come in and find our chainsaw bar bent in half. Impossible to do by accident. Someone had to use serious force. Tuesday, 4 tires slashed clean through, not random cuts, but perfect straight lines. Any tracks? Evidence of who might be doing this?" Pete shook his head. "That's the weird part. Ground's soft from all this warm weather, but we can't find boot prints anywhere near the equipment. Well, you'll see." He led me to the bulldozer, a big yellow caterpillar sitting silent in the morning fog. The tires were cut just like he said. Clean, straight slashes that would have taken a very sharp knife and a lot of strength. But around the machine, pressed deep into the soft earth, were hoof prints. Horse hoof prints. "Pete," I said, kneeling down to examine the tracks, "these are fresh. Made sometime last night." "I know that. But Sam, there ain't been horses in this part of the forest for decades. And look at the size of these prints." He was right. The hoof prints were huge, bigger than any horse I'd ever seen. And they were everywhere around the equipment, like a whole herd had been running circles around the machinery. "Maybe wild horses?" I suggested, though I knew it was weak. "Sometimes they come down from the high country." Pete gave me a look. "Wild horses that know how to use knives on tires?" I didn't have an answer for that. As we walked the site, Pete introduced me to his crew. 7 men, all experienced construction workers, all clearly on edge. Mike Torres, the equipment operator, kept looking over his shoulder like something was following him. James Kim, who ran the surveyor equipment, jumped when a branch cracked in the distance. "The men want to quit," Pete said quietly. "Can't say I blame them." Yesterday evening around sunset, half the crew swears they saw riders in the trees. Just glimpses, you understand, but enough to spook them good. Riders? Men on horses. But when they tried to get a better look, nothing there. And the horses, Pete shook his head. They said the horses had red eyes, like they were glowing. I spent the rest of the day examining the site and interviewing the workers. Everyone had a story. Strange sounds at night when they were packing up. The feeling of being watched from the tree line. Tools that went missing only to turn up in impossible places, like 40 feet up in tree branches. But it was Mike Torres who really got my attention. This was a tough guy, arms like tree trunks, not easily spooked. But when he talked about the previous evening, his voice dropped to a whisper. I was shutting down the dozer around 5:30, he said. Sun was getting low and that fog was rolling in thick. I heard horses coming through the trees. A lot of them, moving fast. But here's the thing, Sam. I could hear the hooves hitting the ground, but I couldn't hear any branches breaking. Like they were running right through the trees without touching them. Did you see anything? Mike nodded slowly. Turned around and there they were. 7 riders, maybe 50 yards out. Couldn't make out details in the fog, but they were sitting still as statues, just watching me. I blinked, and they were gone. But Sam, the horses, I swear their eyes were glowing red in that mist. That night I drove back to my cabin with a lot on my mind. I'd been in these woods for over a decade, and I knew every sound, every animal, every trick the light could play on your eyes. But what the construction crew was describing didn't fit anything natural. As I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the fog roll through the valley, I found myself thinking about my grandfather's stories, about the wild hunt and spirits that couldn't rest, about sacred ground that demanded respect. Maybe it was time to make a phone call. The next morning I called Joseph Running Bear. He was one of the Cherokee elders, and if anyone would know about the spiritual significance of Joyce Kilmer Forest, it would be him. Joseph lived on the reservation about 30 miles south, and I'd worked with him before on cultural preservation issues. Sam Whitehorse, he said when he picked up the phone. I was wondering when you'd call. That gave me pause. You were expecting me. The spirits are restless, boy. Can feel it in the air. What's happening up in the sacred grove? I told him about the construction site, the sabotaged equipment, and the strange horse tracks. Joseph listened without interrupting, making little humming sounds that I remembered from childhood, the way Cherokee elders do when they're processing important information. They've disturbed something, he said finally, something that should have been left alone. I'll come up tomorrow morning. Don't let them do any more work until I get there. Joseph, what exactly are we dealing with here? There was a long pause. The wild hunt, Sam. Your grandfather told you the stories, I'm sure. Some spirits don't rest easy, especially when their honor was stolen from them, and when white men disturb their sleeping place. He didn't finish the sentence. I spent that evening in the forest office, going through old survey maps and historical records. What I found made my blood run cold. The construction site was built right on top of an old Cherokee burial mound dating back to the 1700s. The maps showed it clearly, but somehow it had been overlooked in the environmental impact study. The next morning, I met Joseph at the construction site. At 73, he was still spry, with long gray braids and eyes that seemed to see everything. Pete Morrison was there too, looking like he hadn't slept in days. We had another incident last night, Pete told me as we walked toward the equipment. Mike Torres. He didn't need to finish. I could see Mike sitting on a tree stump, wrapped in a blanket, staring off into the distance. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes. What happened? I asked. James Kim answered. Mike was working late, trying to get the dozer running after yesterday's problems. Around 9 o'clock, we heard him screaming. Found him about a quarter mile into the forest, unconscious. Joseph walked over to Mike, who looked up at him with haunted eyes. Tell me what you saw, son, Joseph said gently. Mike's voice was barely above a whisper. They came out of the fog like ghosts. 7 of them on horses, but not regular horses. These were huge, black as midnight, with eyes like hot coals. The riders. He shuddered. They were Cherokee, I think, but wrong somehow. Too pale, too thin, like they were stretched out. And they were hunting me. Hunting you how? I asked. They rode me down like I was an animal. The horses, they didn't make any noise when they ran. It was like they were floating just above the ground. I ran as fast as I could, but they stayed right behind me, getting closer and closer. I could feel their breath on my neck, cold as winter wind. Joseph nodded grimly. How did you escape? I didn't. They caught me at the creek. The lead rider, he had this lance, old-fashioned Cherokee war lance. He pointed it at my chest, and I don't remember anything after that. Next thing I knew, James was shaking me awake. We examined Mike's clothes. His shirt was torn in 7 places, perfectly straight cuts that looked like claw marks. But underneath, his skin was unmarked. They were testing you, Joseph told Mike, seeing if you were worthy prey. You're lucky they decided you weren't. Worthy prey for what? Pete demanded. Jota. Seth looked at the disturbed earth where the construction had begun. Follow me. He led us to the spot where they'd started excavating for the road foundation. The bulldozer had scraped away about 3 feet of topsoil, exposing what was clearly an ancient burial site. I could see pottery fragments, old stone tools, and what looked like human bones. This is a warrior burial, Joseph said, but not just any warriors. These men were dishonored, cast out by their own people for betraying the tribe to white settlers. They were killed by Cherokee justice and buried here without proper ceremony. Their spirits have been restless for almost 300 years. And we woke them up, Pete said. More than that, you scattered their bones, disturbed their rest. Now they're hunting again, looking for souls to take the place of the honor they lost. As Joseph spoke, I noticed the temperature dropping. The warm December air turned cold, and our breath started showing in white puffs. The fog, which had been thin that morning, began rolling in thick and fast. We need to leave, Joseph said urgently. Now! But as we turned to go, the hoofbeats started. They came from all around us, the sound of dozens of horses moving through the forest at full gallop. But I couldn't see anything except gray fog, getting thicker by the second. The horses seemed to be running in circles, getting closer with each pass. Stay together, I shouted, but my voice sounded muffled and strange in the fog. Mike Torres started screaming again. Through the mist, I caught glimpses of what he was seeing. Dark shapes on horseback, circling us like wolves around prey. The horses were massive, their eyes glowing red in the fog. And the riders were Cherokee warriors, but wrong in every possible way. Their skin was pale as bone, their hair hung in limp tangles, and their eyes were black holes in their faces. They carried traditional weapons, lances, tomahawks, bows, but these were ghostly pale, like they were carved from moonlight. The wild hunt, Joseph whispered. They've come for the living. One of the riders broke from the circle, heading straight for James Kim. The horse moved without touching the ground, floating through the air like smoke. James ran, crashing through the underbrush, but the rider stayed right behind him. I pulled my service pistol, knowing it was useless, but unable to just stand there. The lead rider turned toward me, and I found myself looking into eyes that held no life at all, just an endless hunger for something I couldn't name. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The hoofbeats faded, the fog began to lift, and the riders melted away like smoke. We stood there, in the sudden silence, hearts pounding, trying to process what we'd just experienced. James Kim came stumbling back through the trees, his clothes torn and his face scratched by branches. They chased me to the creek, he gasped. Then they just stopped, like they couldn't cross the water. Joseph nodded. Running water. Old protection against restless spirits. But it won't hold them for long. They're getting stronger. What do they want? I asked. Joseph's face was grave. Redemption, Sam. They need to restore their honor, and the only way they know how is through the hunt. They'll keep taking people until someone gives them what they really need, or until they're stopped. How do we stop them? That's the hard part, Joseph said. Someone has to complete their quest for them. Someone has to give them back their honor. As we packed up to leave the construction site, I noticed that the hoof prints around our equipment had multiplied. Where there had been tracks from maybe 7 horses that morning, now there were hundreds. The spirits were gathering strength. That night, I lay awake in my cabin, listening to the wind in the trees. But underneath the normal forest sounds, I could swear I heard horses running in the distance, getting claws. Osier with each passing hour. The hunt was on, and I was starting to understand that we might all be prey. The next morning brought news that made my blood run cold. James Kim had been found unconscious in his motel room, mumbling in what sounded like Cherokee. The problem was, James didn't speak Cherokee, didn't speak any native language at all. I drove to the clinic where they'd taken him. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the local physician, met me in the hallway with a puzzled look on her face. "Strangest case I've ever seen," she said. "No signs of physical trauma, but he's exhibiting symptoms of severe psychological shock. And Sam, he keeps asking for someone named Three Hawks, in what my Cherokee nurse tells me is nearly perfect traditional Cherokee. But his pronunciation is from 3 centuries ago." I went into James's room. He was sitting up in bed, staring at the wall, whispering words I couldn't understand. When he saw me, his eyes focused for a moment. "Sam," he said in his normal voice. "They're in my head. I can see their memories. 3 Hawks, Running Wolf, Bear Killer. I know their names. I know what they did." "What did they do, James?" His eyes went distant again. "They led the soldiers to the winter camp, showed them the secret paths through the mountains. 200 Cherokee died because of their betrayal. Women, children, elders, all dead because 3 Hawks thought he could save his own family by sacrificing his people." Then James started speaking Cherokee again, his voice taking on a different tone entirely. It was like someone else was using his voice. I called Joseph Running Bear immediately. An hour later, Joseph sat beside James's bed, listening carefully to the Cherokee words flowing from the construction worker's mouth. "He's channeling 3 Hawks," Joseph told me quietly. "The spirit is trying to tell his story through the living man." "Is that normal?" "Nothing about this is normal, Sam. The wild hunt is getting stronger. They're not just hunting anymore. They're trying to possess the living, use them to speak to the world of the dead." Over the next 2 days, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Mike Torres was found wandering the forest at dawn, dressed in clothes that looked like 18th century Cherokee warrior gear, though later investigation proved the clothes were just his normal work gear, somehow transformed. He spoke only Cherokee for 6 hours before snapping back to himself with no memory of what had happened. Pete Morrison called me on the 3rd morning, his voice cracking with panic. "Sam, you need to get up here. We've got a real problem." I found Pete at the construction site with 3 of his remaining workers. 4 others had quit during the night. The equipment had been arranged in a perfect circle, as if the bulldozer and trucks had been picked up and placed by giant hands. In the center of the circle, scratched deep into the earth, were Cherokee symbols that Joseph later identified as war paint patterns. "It happened sometime after midnight," Pete told me. "We had a night watchman, Eddie Carlson, keeping an eye on things. Found him this morning, sitting right in the middle of that circle, wearing war paint made from mud. Eddie was a tough old-timer, a veteran who'd seen action in Korea. But when I talked to him, his hands shook like leaves. They came for me around 2 in the morning, he said, all 7 of them, riding those devil horses. But this time, they didn't chase me. They surrounded me. And the leader, 3 Hawks, he got down from his horse and walked right up to me." "What did he look like up close?" I asked. "Like death, Sam. Like something that should have been buried centuries ago. His skin was gray as old paper, and when he opened his mouth, I could see straight through to the back of his skull. But his eyes were full of pain. What did he want? He painted my face with mud and blood, and suddenly, I could understand Cherokee. He told me their story, how they were forced to choose between their families and their people, how they guided the soldiers because the white men threatened to kill their children if they didn't cooperate, how their own people executed them as traitors without listening to their reasons. Eddie's voice dropped to a whisper. He said they've been hunting for 300 years, trying to catch enough souls to trade for their honor. But nothing they catch is worth what they lost. They're trapped, Sam. Trapped between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And they can't find peace. That afternoon, I called a meeting with Pete Morrison and the remaining construction workers. We gathered at the forest station, and I laid out the situation as clearly as I could. We're dealing with something beyond normal law enforcement, I told them. These are Cherokee spirits that were disturbed when you started excavating the burial mound. Until we can find a way to put them to rest properly, this site isn't safe for anyone. What about our contract? Pete asked. The state's expecting this road completed by spring. The state's not being hunted by dead Cherokee warriors. One of the workers, a young man named Tony Rodriguez, spoke up. Sam, I got a family to feed. I can't just walk away from this job. I understood their problem, but before I could answer, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped 20 degrees. Our breath started showing in white puffs, and the windows began to fog up from the inside. They're here, I said. The hoofbeats started outside, dozens of horses circling the building. Through the frosted windows, we could see dark shapes moving in the fog that had suddenly rolled in. The spirits were getting bolder, manifesting in broad daylight. Then the door opened by itself. 3 hawks stepped into the room, and I got my first clear look at the leader of 2, Wild Hunt. He was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, wearing traditional Cherokee warrior dress that seemed to be made of mist and shadow. His face was gaunt, stretched tight over prominent cheekbones, and his hair hung in long braids decorated with feathers that looked like they were carved from bone. But his eyes were the worst part. They held intelligence, personality, and a pain so deep it made my chest ache just to look at him. He spoke in Cherokee, his voice like wind through dry leaves. Though I'd never been fluent in the language, somehow I understood every word. The earth movers must cease their work, he said. The bones of the dishonored must not be scattered further. Too long have we hunted without finding peace. Too long have we been denied our rest. Pete Morrison, to his credit, stood his ground, even though he was shaking. We'll stop the work, he said. But you have to stop hunting my men. 3 hawks tilted his head, considering. One soul must walk the spirit path with us willingly. One living person must hear our full story and judge whether we deserve redemption. Only then can the hunt end. I stepped forward. I'll do it. Sam, no, Pete protested, but I knew it was the only way. 3 hawks studied me with those terrible, pain-filled eyes. You carry Cherokee blood. You might survive the spirit journey. But know this, if you judge us unworthy of honor, you will join our hunt forever. Your soul will ride with us until the end of time. And if I judge you worthy, then we find peace, and the living are safe. But the choice must be made in the spirit world, not this one. You must come with us willingly tonight when the moon is dark. As suddenly as they'd appeared, the spirits faded away. The temperature returned to normal, and the fog outside began to lift. But I knew the real test was just beginning. That evening, Joseph Running Bear arrived with supplies for a traditional vision quest. Sacred tobacco, cedar, sage, and a small drum made from elk hide. This is dangerous, Sam, he told me as we prepared. Few people have ever or attempted to communicate directly with dishonored spirits and returned unchanged. You'll be walking in the world of the dead while still alive. If you lose your way, your soul might never find its way back to your body. What choice do I have? They'll keep hunting until someone stops them. Joseph nodded grimly. Then we do this right, Cherokee way, with proper ceremony and protection. But Sam, remember who you are when you're in that spirit world. Remember your name, your life, your connection to this earth. That's the only thing that will bring you home. As darkness fell, I prepared to enter a world I'd never believed was real, to judge the honor of men who'd been dead for 3 centuries. The wild hunt was waiting, and one way or another, It would end tonight. At midnight, I walked alone into Joyce Kilmer Forest. Joseph had prepared me with traditional purification rituals, painting my face with sacred symbols and burning cedar smoke around me until every part of my body was blessed. The sacred tobacco was in a pouch on my belt, and I carried the elk-hide drum tucked under my arm. The forest felt different at night, older, more alive. Every shadow seemed to move, and the ancient trees creaked like old bones in the wind. The fog was thick enough to cut with a knife, and I could barely see 10 feet ahead. I made my way to the disturbed burial mound where it all started. The construction equipment sat silent and ghostly in the mist, looking abandoned and forgotten. As I approached the excavation site, I began the traditional Cherokee song Joseph had taught me, beating the drum in a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to make the fog pulse with each strike. The response was immediate. The temperature dropped until my breath came out in thick white clouds. The hoofbeats began, not all around me this time, but approaching from the north where the deepest part of the forest lay. 7 riders emerged from the mist like something from a nightmare. The horses were massive, black as midnight, their eyes glowing red as coals. But in the spirit world, I could see details that hadn't been visible before. The horses bore wounds, arrow holes, lance punctures, and I realized these were the mounts the warriors had died on, still carrying them in death. The riders themselves were terrible to behold. Cherokee warriors in full traditional dress, but their bodies showed the wounds that had killed them. 3 Hawks, their leader, had a tomahawk buried deep in his skull. Running Wolf bore multiple arrow wounds in his chest. Bear Killer's throat had been cut so deep his head tilted at an unnatural angle. But their eyes still held intelligence, personality, and that overwhelming pain I'd seen before. 3 Hawks dismounted and walked toward me. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You have come willingly to hear our story," he said in Cherokee. "Sit, and we will show you the truth of our dishonor." I sat cross-legged on the cold earth, still beating the drum. 3 Hawks touched my forehead with one ghostly finger, and suddenly I wasn't in the forest anymore. I was in a Cherokee village in 1778. It was winter, and snow covered the ground between the wooden houses. Women tended fires while children played in the snow. Old men sat around the central fire, telling stories and smoking pipes. It was peaceful, beautiful. A thriving Cherokee community hidden deep in the Tennessee mountains. Then the vision shifted, and I saw 3 Hawks as he had been in life, a tall, proud warrior with intelligent eyes and laugh lines around his mouth. He sat in his house with his wife and 2 young children, watching his daughter weave a small basket while his son practiced drawing a bow too big for him. "My family," 3 Hawks said, his voice now heavy with love and loss. "Everything I did was for them." The vision changed again. Now I saw the white soldiers, a company of Continental Army troops led by a cold-eyed captain. They had captured 3 Hawks while he was hunting alone, and they made him an offer: guide them to Cherokee villages or watch his family burned alive. I had seen what these soldiers did to other Cherokee, 3 Hawks explained. They killed everyone: warriors, women, children, even the elders. They spared no one. When they showed me the scalps they carried, I knew they would do the same to my people. I watched as 3 Hawks made his terrible choice. He agreed to guide the soldiers, but only to villages that had already been evacuated, places where he knew his warnings had reached first and the people had fled to safety. He thought he could save both his family and his tribe by being clever, but the soldiers were cleverer. They had other Cherokee captives, other guides they'd forced into cooperation. When they realized 3 Hawks was leading them to empty villages, they went back to the winter camp where his family waited. The next vision was the worst. I watched through 3 Hawks' eyes as he returned to find his village burning. His wife and children lay dead in the snow, killed by the very soldiers he'd tried to deceive. But worse than their deaths was what came next. The Cherokee war party that found him standing over his family's bodies assumed the worst. They saw him with the soldiers' tracks all around, saw the evidence of his cooperation, and jumped to the obvious conclusion. Three Hawks tried to explain, tried to tell them about the threats and his attempts to protect everyone. But grief and rage made them deaf to his words. The other 6 warriors, Running Wolf, Bear Killer, and the rest, they had all made similar choices. All had families threatened by the soldiers. All had tried to find ways to save their loved ones without betraying their people. All had failed. All had been executed by their own tribe as traitors. "We died without honor," these Hawks said, as the visions faded and I found myself back in the forest. "Our people believed we sold them for white man's gold. They never learned the truth, that we died trying to save them." "So you've been hunting for 3 centuries trying to restore that honor?" "Yes, but no soul we take can give back what we lost. We cannot find peace because we cannot prove our innocence to those who condemned us. We are trapped between worlds, forever hunting, forever without rest." I understood now. These weren't evil spirits terrorizing innocent people. They were Cherokee warriors who had faced an impossible choice and been condemned for it by their own people. They weren't hunting for sport or malice. They were hunting for justice, for someone to acknowledge that they had died as patriots, not traitors. But there was still the question of the construction workers they'd been terrorizing. "Why hunt the living?" I asked. "They didn't condemn you." Running Wolf answered this time. "When the earth movers disturbed our bones, it awakened our pain. We saw in them the same choice we had faced. Work for the white men against Cherokee sacred ground, or lose their livelihood. We were angry that they chose, as we would not choose again, knowing what we know now." Bear Killer added, "But also, we hoped that if we could make them understand our story, they might speak for us to the living world, might tell others that we were not traitors." I sat in silence for several minutes, the drum still beating in my hands. These spirits had been hunting for justice for 300 years, and now they were asking me to be their judge. If I declared them honorable, they would find peace. If not, I would join their eternal hunt. But really, there was no choice to make. "Three Hawks," I said formally. "You and your warriors died as Cherokee patriots. You faced an impossible choice and tried to save both your families and your people. That you failed doesn't make you traitors. It makes you human. Your honor is intact, and always has been." The effect was immediate. The SEV and warriors straightened, and for the first time I saw peace in their ancient eyes. The wounds on their bodies began to fade, and their appearance changed from the terrible hunting spirits they'd become back to the Cherokee warriors they had been in life. "You have given us what we needed most," Three Hawks said, his voice now warm with gratitude. "Someone to hear our story and judge us worthy. Someone to remember that we died trying to do right." "Your story will be remembered," I promised. "I'll make sure people know the truth." The warriors mounted their horses one last time, but now the horses looked healthy and strong, and the riders sat tall in their saddles like the proud Cherokee warriors they had always been. "The hunt is ended," Three Hawks said. "We go now to join our ancestors in the spirit world. The sacred grove will be at peace." As they rode away into the mist, I heard them singing, a Cherokee traveling song that spoke of going home after a long, hard journey. Their voices faded gradually until only the normal sounds of the forest remained. I sat alone in the fog until dawn, still beating the drum, still processing what I'd experienced. When the sun finally rose and burned away the mist, I was surprised to find Joseph Running Bear waiting for me at the edge of the clearing. "How long have you been there?" I asked. "All night," he replied. "I heard the singing when they left. It's finished?" "It's finished." Joseph nodded approvingly. "You did well, Sam. You gave them what they needed. Someone to listen and someone to remember. That's all any spirit really wants." The change was immediate and dramatic. When Pete Morrison and his crew returned to the construction site the next morning, they found the equipment exactly where they'd left it. No more mysterious rearrangements, no more hoof prints in the mud. The oppressive feeling that had hung over the ruined forest for weeks was gone, replaced by the natural peace of Joyce Kilmer's ancient trees. James Kim recovered completely, with no memory of speaking Cherokee or channeling Three Hawks. Mike, Torres returned to work without fear, though he admitted the experience had given him a new respect for Cherokee culture. Eddie Carlson started reading books about Cherokee history, saying he felt like he owed it to the spirits to understand their world better. But we weren't done yet. I convinced the State Highway Department to reroute the access road around the burial mound rather than through it. It took some bureaucratic wrangling, but Joseph Running Bear's testimony about the site's cultural significance carried weight. The construction project was delayed by 6 months, but it was completed without further supernatural incident. More importantly, we established a proper memorial at the burial site. Working with the Cherokee Nation, we erected a stone marker that told the true story of Three Hawks and his warriors, how they had faced impossible choices during the Revolutionary War and died trying to protect their families and their people. The marker reads, in both English and Cherokee, "Here rest 7 Cherokee warriors who died with honor while trying to save their people and their families. Their sacrifice was misunderstood in life but is remembered with respect today. They were patriots, not traitors." The site has become a place of pilgrimage for Cherokee people from across the region. Every month, Joseph Running Bear leads a ceremony there, offering tobacco and prayers to honor the warriors' memory. The construction workers, led by Pete Morrison, donated money for the memorial and often attend the ceremonies themselves. The experience changed me more than I expected. I started studying Cherokee traditions seriously for the first time, learning the language my grandfather had tried to teach me as a child. I began incorporating traditional Cherokee land management practices into my work as a forest ranger, consulting with tribal elders on decisions that affected sacred sites. My relationship with the forest itself deepened. After walking in the spirit world, I could sense things I'd never noticed before. The emotional history of places, the lingering presence of people who had lived and died among these trees. It wasn't frightening. It was like gaining a new sense that made me more complete. The Forest Service took notice. My report on the Joyce Kilmer incident led to new protocols for working with Native American sacred sites. I was promoted to Cultural Liaison Specialist, helping to bridge the gap between federal land management and tribal concerns. The work was challenging but deeply rewarding, preventing other supernatural incidents by addressing cultural conflicts before they escalated. But perhaps the most significant change was in how I saw my own identity. I'd always known I was part Cherokee, but I'd treated it as just a footnote in my personal history. After hearing Three Hawks' story and understanding the weight of cultural preservation, I realized that being Cherokee wasn't just about genetics. It was about carrying forward the stories, traditions, and values of my ancestors. I started teaching Cherokee history and culture to visiting school groups at the forest. I made sure that every program included the story of Three Hawks and his warriors, emphasizing that history is rarely as simple as it first appears. Many people who had committed seemingly dishonorable acts were actually trying to do the right thing in impossible circumstances. 6 months after the incident, I received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Patricia Whitman, a folklore professor from the University of Tennessee, had heard about the Joyce Kilmer case and wanted to interview me for her research on Southern supernatural encounters. "I've documented dozens of ghost stories from Appalachia," she told me, "but I've never heard of spirits actually finding peace through human intervention. Usually these entities just fade away over time or keep repeating the same patterns indefinitely." I told her, "My name is Rebecca Mullins, but everyone calls me Becky. I've been a park ranger at Cumberland Gap for 13 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Bears, lost hikers, flash floods, you name it. But nothing prepared me for what happened that summer of 1985. I'm what they call a cultural resource specialist, which means I deal with the history side of things. The old cabins, the burial grounds, the stories that make this place more than just pretty scenery. It's personal work for me because my family's been in these mountains for generations. We're Melungeon, mixed blood, they used to say. Part European, part African, part Native American. My great-grandmother would tell stories about how our people lived up in the hollers, keeping to themselves because the world wasn't kind to folks who didn't fit neat categories. At 37, I'd made my peace with those old family tales. The stories about curses and spirits and things that go bump in the night. I figured they were just ways our ancestors explained hardship. When you're poor and people treat you bad because of how you look, it's easier to blame ghosts than face the real ugliness of the world. That August was brutal. The kind of heat that makes your clothes stick to you before you even step outside. Thunderstorms would build up in the valleys, making the air thick and electric, but the rain never seemed to come. Just pressure. Always pressure, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. I was leading my first official dig on a Melungeon settlement site. The university folks had finally agreed to fund a real archaeological study, not just the tourist-friendly stuff they usually wanted. 5 graduate students from UK were helping me, bright kids who actually cared about getting the history right instead of just finding pretty artifacts to put in display, Kay says. The site was about 2 miles up an old logging road in a clearing that most people would walk right past without noticing anything special. But when you know what to look for, you can see the depression where the main cabin used to sit, the scattered rocks that were once chimney stones, the slight rise in the ground where the family garden grew. My grandmother always said our people were buried the old way, with protections and prayers that went back further than any church. I'd never paid much attention to those stories, but on the first day of digging, we found something that made me remember every word she'd ever said about the dead. We were excavating what should have been a simple family plot when David Park, one of my graduate students, called me over to his grid square. David was good people, careful worker, respectful of what we were doing. When I saw his face, I knew we'd found something unusual. "Professor Mullins," he said, using my formal title like he always did when something made him nervous. "You need to see this." The burial he'd uncovered wasn't like anything in my textbooks. The stones around the grave were arranged in perfect circles, not the neat rows you'd expect. But what really got my attention were the grave goods. Silver coins placed over where the eyes would be, iron nails driven into the coffin wood at specific points, and herbs I recognized from my grandmother's old mason jars. "That's mountain protection work," I told the students, trying to keep my voice steady. They weren't just burying their dead, they were making sure they stayed buried. Jennifer Walsh, a sharp girl from Louisville, looked up from her notes. "Protection from what?" I didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. That evening, as we packed up our tools and covered the excavation with tarps, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a little girl sitting in my grandmother's kitchen. That prickly feeling on the back of your neck when you know someone's watching you, but when you turn around, there's nobody there. The mountains were too quiet. No birds singing their evening songs, no insects buzzing in the heat. Even the wind had died down to nothing. It was like the whole world was waiting for something to happen. I should have listened to that feeling. Should have packed up right then and taken those kids back to town. But I was too curious, too proud of finally getting to study my own people's history. I had no idea what we'd already set in motion. The nightmares started that very first night. David Park called me at dawn, his voice shaky over the phone. "Professor, I think I need to talk to someone. Maybe see a doctor or something." I found him at the diner in town, nursing a cup of coffee with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Dark circles under his eyes made him look 10 years older than his 24 years. "I keep dreaming about the dig site," he said, not meeting my eyes. "But it's not empty like we found it. There are people there, a whole family. They're running from something, carrying babies and bundles of clothes. The men have guns, but they're scared. Really scared." He described the people in detail, their clothes, their faces, even their names. Things he couldn't possibly know. Things that weren't in any of the historical records we'd studied. "The strangest part," David continued, "is that they can see me. In the dream, I mean. This old woman, she looks right at me and says, 'Why did you wake us up? We were finally sleeping.'" I tried to reassure him, told him it was just his mind processing the day's work. Archaeologists often dream about the people they study. It's normal, even healthy. But something cold settled in my stomach when he mentioned the old woman. My great-grandmother used to say the same thing about the dead, that they just wanted to sleep, and it was cruel to wake them up. When we got back to the site that morning, things felt different, wrong. The tarps we'd carefully I placed over our work were folded neatly beside the excavation, but none of us remembered folding them. Our tools, which we'd left scattered around the dig squares, were arranged in perfect lines, and there were new holes, 3 small excavations, maybe a foot deep, dug with surgical precision in spots we hadn't even marked yet, as if someone was guiding us to exactly where we needed to dig. Must have been animals, suggested Mark Rodriguez, though he didn't sound convinced. Mark was the practical one, always looking for logical explanations. But animals don't use shovels, and they definitely don't arrange human bones in neat little piles, which is exactly what we found at the bottom of those mysterious holes. Children's bones, small skulls, tiny rib cages, finger bones so delicate they looked like they might crumble if you breathed on them too hard. Each set of remains had been carefully arranged, as if someone was trying to keep the families together even in death. Jennifer was documenting the finds when she suddenly dropped her camera. It clattered against the rocks, the sound unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We all stopped what we were doing and listened. At first, nothing. Then, so faint you might have imagined it, we heard voices, children's voices, singing something that sounded like a lullaby. The singing was coming from underground. Mark grabbed a trowel and started digging frantically where the sound seemed strongest. There's got to be a cave system down there. Sound carries weird in limestone. But I knew these mountains better than any geology textbook. I knew there weren't supposed to be caves in this area. And I knew that lullaby. My grandmother used to sing it to me when I had nightmares. It was old, older than English, mixing Cherokee words with something else I'd never been able to identify. A song to help restless spirits find their way home. The melody was getting clearer, and now we could make out words. Sleep now, little ones, sleep now. The bad men cannot find you. Sleep now, little ones, sleep now. In the dark ground, we will hide you. David dropped his brush and stumbled backward. That's them. That's the family from my dream. The children. They're still here. That's when Jennifer started screaming. She was pointing at something behind us, her eyes wide with absolute terror. We all spun around, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows and the normal sounds of the forest returning, as if someone had just turned the volume back up on the world. But Jennifer kept screaming, kept pointing at empty air until Mark had to physically shake her to get her to stop. "They're burned," she gasped. "The children are all burned, their clothes, their skin, everything's black and peeling, and they want to know why we're digging up their families. They want to know why we can't just leave them alone." She couldn't have known about the fire. We hadn't found any evidence of it yet, hadn't read the old newspaper accounts or the county records. But 2 hours later, when we'd expanded our excavation, we found the charred foundation stones of a cabin and human remains that showed clear signs of death by burning. That night, I drove to see Mahala Collins, the oldest Melungeon descendant still living in the area. She was 93 and sharp as a tack, keeper of all the stories the rest of us had tried to forget. "You dug them up, didn't you?" she said before I'd even explained why I was there. After all these years, someone finally went and woke them up. She was sitting on her front porch, rocking slowly in a chair that was probably older than I was. The evening air was thick with the smell of honeysuckle and something else, something sharp and medicinal that I couldn't identify. "Mahala, I need to know what really happened to our people up there. Not the official story, the real one." Her dark eyes studied my face for a long moment. "Child, some sort of. These are buried deep for good reasons. When you dig up bones, you dig up more than just bones. You dig up all the pain and anger that went into the ground with them." She told me things that weren't in any history book, about the families who lived in peace until the wrong people found out about their mixed blood, about the night riders who came with torches and guns, about how our people tried to fight back, tried to protect their children, but there were too many attackers and too few defenders. 37 people died that night, Mahala said. Men, women, children. Some burned in their cabins, some shot trying to run. But before they died, they did something. something their Cherokee ancestors taught them. They cursed the land and everyone who would ever disturb their rest. Curses aren't real, Mahala. She stopped rocking and looked at me with something that might have been pity. Child, your students are already feeling it, aren't they? The dreams, the voices, the cold spots where there shouldn't be any. That curse has been waiting more than 90 years for someone to be foolish enough to disturb those graves. What did the curse do exactly? It bound their spirits to the land, made them guardians of their own bones. Anyone who disturbs the dead without proper respect, without acknowledging the wrong that was done, well, let's just say the dead remember how to be angry. As I drove back to town that night, the temperature gauge in my truck started acting up. The needle swung wildly between hot and cold, even though the engine was running fine. And in my rearview mirror, I could swear I saw lights following me. Not headlights, but the warm orange glow of torches. When I got back to my apartment, David was sitting on my front steps. His face was pale and his hands were shaking worse than before. "Professor," he said, "I think we're in real trouble. I've been having the dreams all day, even when I'm awake." By the third day, I knew we were dealing with something way beyond normal archaeological work. Jennifer hadn't slept in 48 hours. She'd sit up all night in her hotel room, talking to empty air in a voice that wasn't quite her own. Sometimes she spoke in English, sometimes in languages none of us recognized. But always, she was answering questions nobody else could hear. She says her name was Mary Catherine Gibson, Jennifer told us, her eyes focused on something just over my left shoulder. She was 8 years old when they came. Her mama tried to hide her in the root cellar, but the smoke got to her first. Mark tried to document everything Jennifer said, thinking maybe we could piece together the historical record from her, whatever this was. But his camera wouldn't work around her anymore. The film came out black, and digital equipment just shut down. David wasn't much better. He'd lost 20 pounds and developed this habit of talking to himself in quiet, urgent whispers. When I asked him what he was saying, he looked at me like he'd forgotten I was there. "I'm trying to negotiate," he said. "They want us to leave, but I keep telling them we're trying to help. We're trying to tell their story, get them the recognition they deserve." "David, who exactly are you talking to?" "All of them, the whole settlement. They're not very happy with us, Professor." The other two students, Sarah and Mike, were holding up better, but even they were starting to crack. Mike found handprints on his tent that weren't there when he went to sleep. Small prints, like a child's, but burned into the fabric. Sarah's equipment kept getting moved around, arranged in patterns that looked almost like letters but didn't spell anything in English. And me? I was starting to see them, just glimpses at first, out of the corner of my eye. A woman in a long dress standing at the edge of the tree line. Children playing between the dig squares when I thought no one was looking. An old man with a rifle. Always watching. Always waiting. But it was the temperature changes that really got to me. Even in the August heat, the air around our excavation would drop 30 degrees without warning. We'd be working in our t-shirts, sweating in the humidity, and suddenly we'd be able to see our breath. Frost would form on our tools, on the bones we'd uncovered, on the old stones that marked the family plots. The cold always came with voices. Not the children's lullaby we'd heard before, but adult voices, angry and desperate. They spoke in accents I recognized from my childhood, the old mountain way of talking that mixed languages and ignored grammar rules. But these voices were full of pain, full of rage that had been building for almost a century. "Get out," they'd whisper. "Leave us be. Haven't we suffered enough?" On the fourth day, Mark collapsed. We found him unconscious in the main excavation square, his body temperature so low the paramedics couldn't believe he was still alive. 94 degrees in August heat, with no medical explanation for the hypothermia. At the hospital, he kept mumbling about fire and smoke and people screaming. But mixed in with the trauma talk were names and dates and details about the Melungeon families that we'd never found in our research. "Thomas Gibson," he whispered to me when I visited. "Shot in the back, trying to reach his children. Died watching his house burn down. He's so angry, Professor. They're all so angry." That night, I called an emergency meeting with the remaining students. We met at the diner in town because none of us wanted to go back to the dig site after dark. "I think we need to consider stopping the excavation," I said, the words feeling like betrayal even as I spoke them. "You can't be serious," Sarah protested. "We're making the most important historical discovery in Appalachian studies. We can't quit because of some weird coincidence and stress reactions." But Jennifer looked up from her untouched coffee with eyes that seemed older than her 23 years. "They died protecting their children, and we're digging up those children like they're just objects to be studied. How is that different from what the men with torches did?" "Jennifer, you're not thinking clearly," Sarah said. "You haven't slept in days. You're hallucinating." "Am I?" Jennifer smiled, and for a second her face looked like someone else entirely. Someone older, sadder, angrier. "Mary Catherine says her mama is coming for her soon. Says all the mamas are coming. They don't like people disturbing their babies." The temperature in the diner dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. Our coffee cups frosted over, and everyone's breath started showing in little white puffs. That's when we heard the singing again. Not the children's lullaby this time, but something else. Something that sounded like mourning turned into music, grief given voice. The other diners didn't seem to notice anything unusual. They kept eating and talking like the air hadn't just turned cold enough to see our breath, like there weren't voices filling the air with the saddest song any of us had ever heard. But we heard it. We felt it. And we knew it was meant for us. I made the decision that night to contact Mahala Collins again. If the dead were really angry, maybe she could help us understand what they wanted. Maybe there was still a way to fix this without anyone else getting hurt. When I called her, she picked up on the first ring like she'd been waiting. "They're getting stronger, aren't they?" she said without preamble. "The longer you keep those graves open, the more power they have in this world. And child, let me tell you, these aren't gentle spirits looking for peace. These are people who died in terror and rage, and they've had 90 years to nurse that anger." "What do they want, Mahala?" "Same thing they wanted when they were alive. Protection for their families, respect for their sacrifice, and justice for what was done to them." "How do we give them that?" There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, sadder. "That's the problem, child. The kind of justice they want isn't the kind living people can give." "What do you mean?" "They want the men who burned them to face the same fire. They want the families who drove them away to feel the same terror. They want everyone who ever called them half-breed or mongrel or worse to know what it's like to be hunted." My blood went cold. "Mahala, those people are long dead. But their descendants aren't. And to the dead child, all the living look pretty much the same." That's when I realized we weren't just dealing with angry spirits anymore. We were dealing with ghosts that wanted revenge on the entire world, and we'd given them the perfect opportunity to get it. The next morning, when we arrived at the dig site, every single grave had been opened from the inside. The bones were arranged in perfect family groups on the ground above their graves, as if the dead had climbed out and were waiting for us. But they weren't just bones anymore. David saw them first, and his scream brought the rest of us running. Standing among the remains were figures that looked almost solid in the morning light. Men, women, and children in clothes that belonged to the 1890s. Their faces were clear enough to see expressions of rage and sorrow, but their bodies showed the wounds that had killed them. Bullet holes that wept darkness, burns that still seemed to smoke, and eyes that held a century of accumulated anger. "You disturbed our rest," said a woman who had to be Mary Catherine's mother. Her dress was charred black, and her hair hung in burned strands around a face that would have been beautiful, if not for the terrible knowledge in her eyes. "You opened our graves without permission, without respect, without understanding what you were unleashing." I found my voice somehow. "We were trying to tell your story, to give your people the recognition they deserve." "Our story?" An old man stepped forward, and I Recognized him as Thomas Gibson from Mark's description. Half his face was missing, blown away by the gunshot that killed him. Our story is pain and death and being hunted like animals. Is that what you want to preserve? Jennifer was standing perfectly still, but tears were streaming down her face. They don't want to be remembered, she whispered. They just want their children to be safe. They want to rest. Then why won't you let us? This from a boy who couldn't have been more than 10, his small body riddled with bullet wounds. Why did you dig us up and scatter our bones and make us remember everything we tried so hard to forget? That's when I understood. The spirits weren't just angry about being disturbed. They were trapped by our excavation, forced to relive their deaths over and over again, unable to return to whatever peace they'd found in the centuries since the massacre. Tell us what you need, I said. Tell us how to make this right. The ghost of Thomas Gibson smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. Justice. We need justice. The people who hurt you are dead. They've been dead for decades. But their kind still live. People who look at mixed blood and see something to be destroyed. People who would drive families from their homes and call it righteousness. His eyes fixed on mine, and I felt a cold that went deeper than my bones. People like the ones who own this land now. Like the ones who wanted to build a shopping center where our children are buried. I hadn't known about the development plans. The university had kept those details from me, probably knowing I'd never agree to the excavation if I knew our work was just a prelude to bulldozers and concrete. You want revenge, I said. We want protection. For our children, for our memory, for others like us who might face the same hatred we did. The woman's voice was soft and, almost gentle. But we've been angry for so long we've forgotten how to protect without destroying. Sarah, who'd been silent through this whole impossible conversation, suddenly spoke up. There has to be another way. You're not murderers. You were families, people who just wanted to live in peace. We were, agreed the old man. But death changes you. Violent death, meaningless death. It twists the spirit. We've become what we never wanted to be. That's when I remembered something Mahala had told me about Melungeon burial practices, about forgiveness rituals and spirit guidance, and ways to help the dead find peace instead of vengeance. What if we could help you remember who you were before the anger? I asked. What if there was a way to honor your deaths without perpetuating the cycle of violence? The spirits looked at each other, a moment of communication that passed between them faster than words. Finally, the woman nodded. There is an old way, a ceremony that requires acknowledgement of the wrong done, proper burial with protection and respect, and, she hesitated, and a guardian. Someone to stay and make sure the dead remain undisturbed. I'll do it, I said without thinking. Becky, no. David grabbed my arm. You can't throw away your career for this. But looking at those ghost children, at the pain in their translucent faces, I knew I didn't have a choice. These were my people, my ancestors, my responsibility. What does being a guardian mean exactly? You would watch over this place. Make sure it remains protected, and you would carry the memories, not just of how we died, but of how we lived, the stories, the traditions, the language and customs that died with us. It was a heavy burden, but one that felt right in a way I couldn't explain. And if I agree to this, you'll find peace? You'll stop the haunting? The woman smiled, and for the first time it was an expression of warmth instead of rage. We'll sleep, child. Finally, we'll sleep. The ceremony took place that night, under a full moon that seemed brighter than it had any right to be. Mahala came to help, bringing herbs and sage and knowledge that stretched back generations. The remaining students participated too, understanding somehow that they'd been part of something larger than an archaeological dig. We reburied the remains properly, with all the protections and prayers our ancestors had used. We acknowledged the injustice done, spoke the names of the dead, and promised that their story would be remembered with truth and respect. And as the last shovel of earth covered the last grave, I felt something settle into my bones. A weight, but also a strange kind of completion. Like I'd found the piece of myself I'd been missing without knowing it. The ghosts faded as the sun rose, but not before the woman, I learned her name was Sarah Elizabeth Gibson, touched my hand with fingers that felt like cool mist. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for helping us remember how to love instead of hate." That was 30 years ago, and I'm still here. The university tried to fire me for halting the excavation, but the publicity from the students' experiences, carefully documented and surprisingly credible, actually boosted interest in Melungeon history. I ended up with more job security than I'd ever had before. Mark recovered fully, though he changed his major from archaeology to counseling. He said he wanted to help people deal with trauma, having experienced firsthand how the past can haunt the present. David became a writer, specializing in respectful historical fiction about marginalized communities. Jennifer disappeared for about 5 years, then came back as a traditional healer, specializing in helping spirits find peace. The land where the settlement used to be is now protected as a cultural heritage site. There's a simple marker there listing the names of all 37 people who died in the massacre and acknowledging their contributions to Appalachian culture. School groups visit sometimes, and I tell them the real story, not the ghost part, but the history part, the part about families who just wanted to live in peace. I never see the spirits anymore, but I feel them sometimes. A warmth in the air on cold mornings, a sense of approval when I'm telling their stories right, a gentle presence that reminds me I'm not alone in this work. The development company that owned the land tried to fight the heritage designation, but their lawyers kept having problems. Equipment would break down at crucial meetings, important documents would disappear, and key personnel would call in sick with inexplicable illnesses that cleared up as soon as they dropped the case. I may have smiled when I heard about that. My job changed after that summer. I became something between a park ranger and a community guardian, helping other Melungeon families reconnect with their history, advising other archaeological projects on cultural sensitivity, and making sure certain burial sites stay undisturbed. Because here's what I learned. Some history needs to be preserved and honored, but not excavated. Some stories are better told by the living than exhumed with the dead. And some ancestors protect their descendants best when they're allowed to rest in peace. I never married, never had children of my own, but I've helped raise a generation of young people who know their heritage and aren't ashamed of their mixed blood. I've seen Melungeon culture celebrated instead of hidden, studied instead of stereotyped. And every now and then, when I'm walking the mountain trails alone at twilight, I hear children singing. Not the mournful lullaby from that summer of terror, but something joyful, something that sounds like freedom. The dead are sleeping peacefully now, but they're not forgotten. And I'm still here, still watching, still making sure it stays that way. Because some promises, once made to the dead, can never be broken. And some guardianships last a lifetime. The mountains remember everything, and now finally, so do we. My name is Michael O'Brien, and I've been fighting fires for 17 years. Most people call me Mickey. I've jumped out of planes into burning forests, led crews through walls of flame, and seen things that would make grown men cry. But nothing prepared me for what happened on Mount Rogers in the summer of 1979. I was 43 then, a fire management specialist with the Forest Service. Started as a volunteer firefighter back home in Boston before moving to Virginia. My ex-wife used to say, I loved fire more than I loved her. Maybe she was right. Fire makes sense to me. It follows rules. Give it fuel, oxygen, and heat, and it burns. Take one away, and it dies. Simple. That July was different from the start. We hadn't seen rain in 6 weeks. The mountains were dry as kindling, and every day the temperature climbed over 100 degrees. Humidity dropped so low our equipment crackled with static. Perfect conditions for a disaster. Mount Rogers sits in the heart of Jefferson National Forest, the highest peak in Virginia. Most tourists stick to the easier trails, But the real wilderness stretches for miles with nothing but deer paths and old logging roads. That's where we got the call about a lightning strike. Small fire, the dispatcher said. Caught early. Should be routine. I laughed at that. 17 years in, and I still believed in routine fires. I picked my crew carefully. Jake Martinez had 10 years of experience and knew the mountain better than anyone. Tom Bradley was solid, quiet, dependable, never panicked under pressure. Dave Kim was our equipment specialist, could fix anything with duct tape and determination. Lisa Park was tough as nails despite being half the size of the men, and Carl Thompson rounded out the team with his steady hands and calm voice. We loaded up the truck at dawn, standard gear, axes, shovels, fire retardant, water pumps, and enough supplies for 3 days. The mountain looked peaceful in the early morning light, covered in that blue haze that gives the Blue Ridge its name. Beautiful morning for it, Jake said, checking his radio. I nodded, but something felt off. The birds weren't singing. In 17 years of fighting fires, I'd learned to read the signs. Animals always know first when something's wrong. But that morning, the forest was too quiet. We drove up the winding mountain road, past farms and trailer homes where people still lived off the land, like their grandfathers did. At Miller's store, we stopped for coffee and directions to the fire access road. "Y'all be careful up there," said the old woman behind the counter. Everyone called her Granny Elsie. "That's devil country once you get past the ridge." Tom laughed. "Ma'am, we're firefighters. We don't worry about devils." She didn't smile back. "You should. Some fires ain't natural. Some fires burn more than trees." I'd heard mountain superstitions before. Growing up Catholic in Boston, I thought I knew about devils and evil. Real evil came from people. Drunks who threw cigarettes out car windows, campers who didn't put out their fires, developers who cut corners on electrical wiring. The devil was just a word people used when they couldn't explain their own stupidity. But as we drove higher into the mountains, leaving civilization behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The trees seemed to lean in closer to the road. Shadows fell in strange patterns. Even with the windows down and the morning breeze, the air felt heavy. "Radio check," I called to the crew. "Jake, copy. Tom, copy. Dave, copy. Lisa, copy. Carl, copy." All good. Professional voices, calm and ready. These were people I'd trust with my life. People I had trusted with my life more times than I could count. The fire access road, Yoshua, as barely more than 2 ruts through the trees. We bounced and jolted for 3 miles before we smelled the first hint of smoke. Not the clean smell of a campfire, but something sharper, something that made my eyes water. "There," Jake pointed through the windshield. I saw it then. A thin column of white smoke rising from a ridge about a mile ahead. It looked small, contained. The kind of fire we could knock down in a couple hours and be back home for dinner. Looking back now, I know that was the last moment any of us felt safe. The last moment we thought we understood what we were dealing with. In 17 years of fighting fires, I'd learned that assumptions could kill you. I just never thought they'd kill you from the inside out. We parked at the trailhead and geared up. Full protective clothing despite the heat, thick jackets, hard hats, boots that could walk through coals. In this business, the gear keeps you alive. The hike to the fire took 40 minutes through dense forest. Oak trees older than the country, mountain laurel thick as walls, and everywhere that unnatural quiet. No bird songs, no insect buzz. Even our boots seemed too loud on the forest floor. "Wind's wrong," Jake said, checking his compass. "Fire should be spreading northeast with this breeze, but look at that smoke." He was right. The smoke column rose straight up, then seemed to bend back on itself. In 17 years, I'd never seen smoke behave like that. "Atmospheric inversion," Dave suggested. "Heat layer trapping the smoke." I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. We crested the ridge and saw the fire below us. It wasn't big, maybe 2 acres, but something about it made my skin crawl. The flames moved wrong. Instead of spreading naturally with the wind and terrain, they seemed to form patterns. Geometric shapes that made no sense. "Jesus," Tom whispered. "Look at that." The fire was burning in what looked like a perfect star shape. 5 points of flame, reaching out from a central core, each point exactly the same size. In the center, the flames burned white-hot while the edges flickered yellow and red. "Never seen anything like that," Lisa said, and I heard the worry in her voice. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is O'Brien. We're on scene. Fire behavior is unusual, requesting aerial reconnaissance." Static answered me, then more static. "Base, do you copy?" Nothing. Dave checked his radio. "Equipment's working fine. Must be the mountains blocking the signal. We'd deal with communication problems before. Part of the job. But something felt different this time. It felt like we were being cut off on purpose. "All right, people," I said. "Let's do this by the book. Jake, you and Tom start cutting a fire line on the north side. Lisa, you and Carl set up the water pump. Dave, you're with me. We'll assess the situation and plan our attack." Everyone nodded and moved out. Professional, calm. These were good people doing a job they understood. The first sign of real trouble came 20 minutes later. I was walking the fire perimeter with Dave when we heard Jake scream. Not a shout or a call for help, a scream of pure terror that echoed off the mountains. We ran toward the sound, crashing through underbrush and jumping fallen logs. Found Tom standing at the edge of the fire line, staring down at something. His face was white as paper. "Tom, where's Jake?" He pointed with a shaking hand. Jake Martinez was lying in a burned area about 10 feet inside the fire perimeter. What was left of him? The body was burned beyond recognition, just a black shape that might have been human. But his gear was untouched. His hard hat sat beside him, not even scorched. His jacket, his tools, everything intact. "That's impossible," Dave said. "Nothing burns that hot without affecting the surrounding area." I knelt beside the body, fighting back nausea. In 17 years of firefighting, I'd seen burn victims before. But this was different. The burns weren't on the outside working in, they were on the inside working out. Like Jake had been cooked from within. "How do you burn from the inside out?" Tom asked in a voice that sounded like a lost child. I didn't have an answer. I'd never seen anything like it. Never heard of anything like it. The medical examiner would later say Jake's internal temperature had reached over 800 degrees while his skin and clothes remained relatively normal. But we didn't know that then. All we knew was that Jake was dead in a way that made no sense, and we were alone on a mountain with a fire that burned in perfect geometric patterns. "Pack it up," I said. "We're calling for backup and getting off this mountain." But when we tried to leave, we found the fire had spread behind us. Not in the natural pattern fires should spread, but in straight lines that cut across our escape route. Perfect barriers of flame that seemed designed to keep us trapped. "Mickey," Lisa's voice came over the radio. "You need to see this." We found her and Carl at the water pump, staring at something on the ground. Burned into the earth were marks that looked like hoof prints, but they were huge, each print the size of a dinner plate, and they were burned into solid rock. "What kind of animal makes prints like that?" Carl asked. I knelt down and touched one of the prints. The stone was still warm. No, not warm. Hot. Hot enough to hurt. That's when Tom Bradley burst into flames. He was standing 20 feet away from any fire, holding a water container, talking about getting off the mountain. Then he stopped mid-sentence and looked at something none of us could see. "No," he said to the empty air. "No, I won't." "Tom," I called, "what are you talking about?" He turned toward me, and his eyes were wide with terror. "It wants me to come closer. It's telling me to walk into the fire." "Tom, there's nobody there." "Yes, there is. It's beautiful and terrible, and it's talking to me, and..." That's when he ignited. Not caught fire. Ignited. Like someone had poured gasoline inside him and struck a match. Flames erupted from his mouth, his eyes, his fingertips. He burned from the inside out, just like Jake. screaming for maybe 10 seconds before the fire consumed his vocal cords. The water container he'd been holding never got warm. Dave was throwing up behind a tree. Lisa and Carl stood frozen, staring at the place where Tom had been standing. There was nothing left but a pile of ash in a perfect human outline. "We have to get out of here," Carl whispered. I tried to lead them back to the truck, but every path we tried was blocked by walls of fire. The flames followed no natural pattern. They rose straight up from the ground like curtains, burning without fuel, forming barriers that herded us like sheep. That's when we saw it. The thing that had killed Jake and Tom stepped out from behind a wall of flame. It was 12 feet tall and made of living fire, white hot at the core with flames dancing around it like a cloak. Where it walked, the stone beneath its feet burned and melted. It had the shape of a man, but wrong. Too tall, too broad, with arms that hung to its knees, and a head that seemed to shift and flicker like a candle flame in wind. When it looked at us, I saw eyes like burning coals. "My God," Lisa whispered. The thing spoke then, its voice like the roar of a wildfire. But somehow, we understood every word. "You have entered my domain," it said. "Your souls will feed my fires." The thing that called itself Master of the Mountain began to circle us like a predator playing with wounded prey. Each step left burning hoof prints in the stone. The air around it shimmered with heat that made breathing feel like swallowing fire. "What do you want?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. It laughed, and the sound was like trees exploding in a forest fire. "I want what I have always wanted, what was promised to me long ago, souls to burn, hearts to consume, fear to taste." Dave made a run for it. I saw him break away from our group, sprinting toward what looked like a gap in the firewall. The demon, because that's what it was, no point pretending otherwise, turned its burning head to watch. "Let him go," it said in that voice like crackling logs. "Let him think he can escape." Dave made it maybe 100 yards before we heard him scream. When we found him later, he was nothing but ash arranged in a perfect human outline, just like Tom. But Dave's outline was twisted, arms reaching forward as if he'd been trying to crawl away even as the fire consumed him from within. "3 down, 3 to go," the demon said, and I swear it was smiling. That's when the memories came flooding back. 17 years of fighting fires. But before that, 17 years of Catholic school. Sister Mary Catherine teaching us about demons and possession. Father O'Malley explaining the difference between natural evil and supernatural evil. "You're bound here," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "You can't leave this mountain." The demon's fiery head turned toward me. "Clever little priest boy. Yes, I am bound. Bound by the blood and sacrifice of those who called me here. Bound to this place until the end of days. But within my domain, I am absolute." Lisa grabbed my arm. "Mickey, what's it talking about?" I was starting to remember stories I had heard from the old-timers. Mount Rogers had a history. Back in the 1800s, there had been rumors of devil worship in the high country, a group of settlers who'd turned away from God and made pacts with darker powers. People found burned to death in ways that made no medical sense. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "Since 1847, it said, when the fools thought they could control me, use my power for their petty human desires. They learned the truth about making bargains with the devil." The fire around us began to pulse in rhythm with its words. The flames formed shapes, twisted faces screaming in agony, hands reaching out for help that would never come. "You killed them too." "I consumed them. Just as I consumed all who came before, just as I will consume you." Carl had found his voice. "You're just another fire," he said, his Baptist upbringing giving him strength. "Fire can be fought. Fire can be stopped." The demon laughed again. "Try, little man. Use your water and your chemicals. See how well they work against the fires of hell." Carl grabbed the pump sprayer and aimed it at the demon. Holy water might have worked, but we didn't have holy water. We had fire retardant and mountain stream water and human courage against something that had been killing people for over a century. The water hit the demon and evaporated before it could touch the burning flesh. The retardant burst into flame in midair. Our equipment was useless against something that existed beyond the normal rules of physics. "My turn," the demon said. It reached out with one burning hand toward Carl. I saw Carl's eyes go wide, saw him start to shake his head like he was arguing with someone we couldn't hear. "Fight it," I yelled. "Don't listen to it." But Carl was already walking toward the demon, his movements jerky like a puppet on strings. "It's showing me things," he said in a voice that didn't sound like his own. "Beautiful things, things I've always wanted." "Carl, no!" He walked straight into the demon's embrace and exploded into flames. The screaming lasted longer this time. Carl was a strong man with strong faith, and he fought the fire even as it consumed him from within. But in the end, he joined the growing collection of human ash outlines on the mountain. Lisa and I were alone with the thing that had killed 4 of our friends. "Two little piglets," it said, circling us again. "Which one should burn next?" That's when I remembered something else from Catholic school. Something Sister Mary Catherine had made us memorize. The words came back to me like muscle memory from Acadi's past. "The power of Christ compels you," I said. The demon stopped moving. For just a moment, the flames around its head flickered. "Interesting," it said. "You remember the old words, but words without faith are just noise, priest boy." "I'm not a priest." "No. But you were raised by priests, trained by priests. You know the rituals even if you've forgotten how to believe." It was right. I'd walked away from the church after Vietnam, after seeing what men could do to each other. Stopped believing in God when I couldn't understand why bad things happened to good people. But the training was still there, buried under years of cynicism and disappointment. Lisa grabbed my hand. "Mickey, what are you thinking?" I looked around at the burning landscape, at the ash outlines of my friends, at the demon that had turned my crew into fuel for its supernatural fire. For the first time in 20 years, I started to pray. Not the casual prayers of foxhole conversions or desperate moments. Real prayer. The kind Sister Mary Catherine had taught us. The kind that assumes God is listening even when the world looks like hell. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." The demon hissed and took a step back. The flames around us flickered and dimmed. "Your God is not here, priest boy. Your God has never been here. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." Lisa joined in, her Methodist upbringing giving her the words. Together our voices rose above the crackling of supernatural fire. "Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." The demon was backing away now, its form flickering like a candle in wind. The firewalls around us began to waver. "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." "Enough!" the demon roared, and the sound shook the mountains. "You think your human prayers can banish me? I have burned here for over a century. I am eternal." But I could see it was weakening. The flames that made up its body were no longer white-ho, till they flickered orange and red like normal fire. "For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen." The demon let out a shriek of rage and pain. The firewalls collapsed, leaving us a clear path off the mountain. "Run," I told Lisa. But even as we fled down the mountain trail, I knew the fight wasn't over. The demon was bound to Mount Rogers, weakened but not destroyed. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered something else from Catholic school. There was an old church somewhere on this mountain, built by a circuit-riding preacher in the 1890s, abandoned for decades but still consecrated ground. If we could reach it, we might have a chance. If we could reach it before the demon recovered its strength and came hunting for us again. We ran through the forest like the devil himself was chasing us, which wasn't far from the truth. Behind us, I could hear the demon's roar of rage echoing off the mountains. The prayer had hurt it, weakened it, but not destroyed it. "Where are we going?" Lisa gasped as we stumbled down a deer trail in the growing darkness. "There's an old church somewhere on this mountain," I said. "My grandfather told me stories about it when I was a kid. A circuit preacher built it back in the 1890s to fight the devil worship that was happening up here. You think it's still there? It has to be." We'd been running for an hour when we smelled smoke again. Not the clean smell of burning wood, but that sharp, wrong smell that made your eyes water. The demon was tracking us, and it was getting closer. "This way," I said, following a half-remembered path from childhood camping trips. The old logging road was barely visible under decades of fallen leaves and growing vines. But it was there. My grandfather had brought me up here once when I was 12, told me about the brave preacher who'd built a church to stand up against the evil that had taken root in these mountains. "The devil came first," he'd said in his thick Irish accent. "But God always sends someone to fight back." We followed the road, through thick forest, guided by moonlight and desperation. Behind us, the smell of smoke grew stronger. Trees began to burst into flames as we passed, not from any natural fire, but from the demon's presence. Then we saw it. A small wooden building nestled in a clearing, its white paint faded and peeling but still standing. The church was smaller than I remembered, just 4 walls and a steeple with a simple cross on top. But it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. "Is that it?" Lisa asked. "That's it." We ran the last 100 yards and threw ourselves against the church door. It was unlocked, as if it had been waiting for us. Inside, the air felt different, cooler, calmer, safe in a way that made no logical sense but felt absolutely real. The pews were still there, rough wooden benches worn smooth by decades of use. A simple altar stood at the front with a wooden cross mounted on the wall behind it. Everything was covered in dust, but nothing was rotted or damaged. The church had been abandoned for nearly a century, but something had preserved it. "We made it," Lisa said, collapsing onto a front pew. That's when the demon arrived. It came through the forest like a walking wildfire, setting trees ablaze with every step. But when it reached the edge of the church clearing, it stopped. The flames that made up its body flickered and dimmed. "Come out, priest boy," it called in that voice like crackling logs. "Come out and face me." I walked to the church door and looked out. The demon stood at the edge of the clearing, 12 feet of living flame that hurt to look at directly. But it couldn't come closer. Some invisible barrier held it back. "Consecrated ground," I said. "You can't cross it." "I cannot enter the church," it admitted. "But I can wait. And when you grow hungry, when you grow thirsty, when you grow desperate enough to leave your sanctuary, I will be at your church." It was right. We were trapped. The church would protect us for now, but we couldn't stay forever. No food, no water, no way to call for help. Eventually, we'd have to come out. "There has to be another way," Lisa said. I looked around the little church, searching for something, anything that might help. That's when I saw them. Books on a shelf behind the altar. The preacher's library, preserved along with everything else. I pulled down a leather-bound volume and opened it. The title page read, "Rituals and Prayers for the Banishment of Evil Spirits" by Reverend Joshua Miller, 1891. "Listen to this," I said, reading aloud. "The demon that plagues this mountain was summoned by devil worshippers in 1847. They thought they could control it, use its power for their own purposes. But demons cannot be controlled, only bound. The creature is trapped within the boundaries of Mount Rogers by the very ritual that summoned it." "So it can't leave," Lisa said. "But it can't be destroyed either." I kept reading. "The binding can be broken in one of 2 ways. Either the demon consumes enough souls to break free of its restraints, or..." I paused, hardly believing what I was reading. "Or what?" "Or a willing soul takes its place." Lisa stared at me. "What does that mean?" "Someone has to volunteer," Someone has to walk into the demon's embrace willingly, without fear or coercion. Their sacrifice breaks the binding and banishes the demon back to hell. That's suicide. That's faith. Outside, the demon was growing impatient. The flames around the clearing burned brighter, hotter. Trees that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash in seconds. "I know you're reading the preacher's book," it called. "I know what it says about willing sacrifice. But who among you has faith strong enough to die for strangers? Who among you loves God more than life itself?" It was right to be confused. Dent. I'd walked away from the church decades ago. My faith was rusty, uncertain, built more on desperation than devotion. Lisa was stronger in her beliefs, but asking someone else to die for my mistakes felt like cowardice. But then I remembered something else my grandfather had told me. Faith isn't about being certain, Mickey. Faith is about doing what's right, even when you're scared, even when you don't understand why. I looked at the cross on the altar, then at Lisa. "There's something else in the book," I said. "The ritual has to be performed at dawn. The demon is weakest when darkness gives way to light." "How long until sunrise?" I checked my watch. 4 hours. So we wait. We spent those 4 hours preparing. I read every page of Reverend Miller's book, learning about the demon and the rituals needed to banish it. Lisa prayed in her own way, drawing strength from faith that had never wavered. When the first light of dawn touched the mountains, I knew it was time. "I have to go out there," I said. "No." Lisa grabbed my arm. "There has to be another way. This is the way. This is why we survived when the others didn't. Not because we were lucky or smart, but because we were chosen for this." I kissed her forehead like a brother might kiss a sister, picked up the wooden cross from the altar and walked toward the door. "Wait," Lisa said. "Take this." She handed me a small bottle of water from the altar. "Holy water. Reverend Miller blessed the well behind the church. It's been here for over a century." I took the bottle and walked outside into the dawn light. The demon was waiting, its flames dimmed but not extinguished. When it saw me, it straightened to its full height. "So, priest boy, have you come to feed my fires? I've come to send you back to hell." I walked to the center of the clearing, right up to the edge of the demon's reach. This close, the heat was unbearable. My clothes began to smoke. "I offer myself willingly," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Not from despair or coercion, but from faith. From love of the Mut, people you would kill if I don't stop you. The demon hesitated. "You do not have enough faith, priest boy. You walked away from your God." "Maybe, but God never walked away from me." I threw the holy water at the demon's core. Where it struck, the flames turned blue and white, burning with cold fire instead of heat. The demon screamed and staggered backward. "I banish you," I said, holding up the wooden cross. "By the power of Christ, by the sacrifice of the willing, by the love that conquers fear, I banish you back to the hell that spawned you." The demon lunged forward, wrapping me in flames that should have killed me instantly. But instead of burning from the inside out like the others, I felt peace. The fire that touched me was warm, not scorching, cleansing, not destroying. "Impossible," the demon gasped. "Nothing's impossible with faith," I said. The demon's form began to collapse. The flames that made up its body flickered and died. With a final shriek of rage and defeat, it imploded into nothing, leaving only a circle of burned ground where it had stood. I was still alive, singed and exhausted, but alive. The binding was broken. The demon was gone. The official report said it was a flashover incident combined with equipment malfunction. 4 firefighters dead, 2 survivors suffering from smoke inhalation and trauma. The families got death benefits. The Forest Service implemented new safety protocols. Mount Rogers High Country was closed to public access due to extreme fire hazard conditions. Nobody mentioned the demon. I tried to go back to work, but I couldn't. Every time I saw flames, I remembered Tom Bradley burning from the inside out. Every time someone lit a cigarette, I heard Jake Martinez screaming. I transferred to a desk job in Roanoke, pushing papers and approving budgets instead of fighting fires. The nightmares lasted for months. I'd key up covered in sweat. Sure, I could smell that wrong smoke that made your eyes water. Lisa had them too. We talked on the phone sometimes, two survivors trying to make sense of something. That made no sense to anyone who hadn't been there. I went back to church. Not because I'd found perfect faith on that mountain, but because I'd learned that faith doesn't have to be perfect to be real. Father McKenna listened to my story without judgment, helped me understand that surviving when others died didn't make me guilty. It made me responsible. Responsible for remembering. Responsible for watching. Responsible for making sure it never happened again. I go back to Mount Rogers every few months, not to the high country where the demon lived, but to the little white church in the clearing. I maintain it now, fix the roof when it leaks, replace broken windows, keep the weeds from taking over the graveyard behind it. The church is still consecrated ground, still safe, still a beacon of light in a place that knew too much darkness. Sometimes other firefighters ask me about that summer. The old-timers remember the incident, remember that something was wrong with the official story. I tell them what I can without sounding crazy. Watch for fires that burn in geometric patterns. Pay attention when your equipment fails for no reason. Trust your instincts when the forest gets too quiet. Most of them think I'm just a burned-out old firefighter who couldn't handle losing his crew. Maybe they're right. Maybe the trauma made me imagine things that weren't there. Maybe the demon was just bad luck and worse weather and human error stacked up in impossible ways. But I know what I saw. I know what I fought. And I know that some fires burn more than flesh and bone. They burn souls. The Mount Rogers High Country is still closed to the public. The official reason is fire danger. But I know the real truth. Some places are too dangerous for ordinary people. Some places need to be watched by people who understand that the world is bigger and darker and more mysterious than most folks will, and to believe. I'm 68 now, getting ready to retire from my desk job and spend more time at the little church. Lisa visits sometimes, bringing her grandchildren to see the mountains. We don't talk about what happened that summer. We don't need to. We both carry it with us every day. The demon is gone. I banished it back to whatever hell spawned it. But Mount Rogers remembers. The mountain itself is scarred by decades of supernatural fire, and scars have a way of reopening when you least expect it. So I watch. I wait. I maintain the church and keep the faith and hope I never have to face anything like that again. But if I do, I'll be ready. Because some fires can only be fought with faith. And some battles can only be won by people willing to sacrifice everything for strangers they'll never meet. My name is Michael O'Brien, and I've been fighting fires for 43 years. Some of them were just fires. Some of them were so much more. My name is Joseph Strongbear, but most folks just call me Joe. I've been a park ranger for 20 years now, working the wild places where most people never go. My mom was Cherokee, my dad was Lakota, and they both taught me to read the forest like other people read books. But even with all that training, nothing could have prepared me for what happened on Clinch Mountain in October of 1971. I was 44 years old then, with a college degree in wildlife biology and more time in the woods than most people spend indoors. I thought I'd seen everything there was to see. Black bears, mountain lions, even the occasional wolf that wandered down from up north. I was wrong. The call came in on a Tuesday morning, cold and foggy like October mornings get in the Virginia mountains. Sheriff Davies was on the radio, his voice tight with something I couldn't quite place. "Joe, you need to get up to Clinch Mountain. We got a situation." I grabbed my gear and drove the winding mountain roads through fog so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The Cherokee always said fog was when the spirit world got closest to ours. Back then, I just thought it was weather. The hunting guides were waiting for me at the old logging road. Red Murphy and his crew, men I'd known for years. Red was pale as creek sand, which was strange because nothing much bothered him. It's not right, Joe, Red said, lighting his third cigarette since I'd arrived. Whatever killed that deer, it ain't natural. He led me through the pines to a small clearing where the leaves were still green despite the season. In the center lay a white-tailed buck, a big one, maybe 12 points. But it wasn't the size that made my stomach turn. It was how it died. The throat was cut clean as a razor, not torn like a normal predator kill. The organs were gone, removed so neat it looked like surgery, and around the carcass, so. Mion had arranged small stones in a perfect circle. Animals don't do this, I muttered, kneeling beside the deer. That's what I keep telling myself, Red said. But look at this. He showed me tracks pressed deep in the soft earth. They were cat tracks, all right, but wrong somehow. The pads were too big, the claws too long, and the spacing between them. It was like something had been walking on 2 legs, then dropped to 4. Could be a mountain lion, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe them. Mountain lions don't walk upright, Joe, and they sure don't arrange rocks in circles. That night I drove home through the fog thinking about what I'd seen. My grandmother used to tell stories about the Iwa, the wampus beast, when I was little. A Cherokee woman cursed to become half human, half cougar for spying on the men's sacred ceremonies. I'd always figured it was just a story to keep kids from wandering off at night. But lying in bed, listening to the wind in the pines outside my cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the darkness beyond my windows. 3 days later, Red Murphy called again. This time, his voice was shaking. Joe, you need to get up here right now. It got Bob Richardson. I found the hunting party huddled around their trucks like sheep hiding from wolves. Bob Richardson was on the ground covered by a tarp, and I could smell the blood from 20 feet away. Richardson had been a good hunter, careful and respectful, the kind who never wasted meat and always followed the rules. But whatever had killed him hadn't followed any rules I knew. Found him at the base of that big oak, said Mike Torres, another hunter in the group. Claw marks start about 30 feet up the trunk and go straight down. Nothing climbs down a tree like that, Joe. Nothing natural. I pulled back the tarp and immediately wished I hadn't. Richardson's wounds showed both animal claws and what looked like human fingernails. His eyes were wide with terror, frozen in his final moment of understanding that something impossible was happening to him. Did anyone see what did this? I asked. The hunters looked at each other. Finally, Dave Kim spoke up. I saw something moving through the trees about an hour before we found Bob. It was big, cat-like, but he paused, struggling with words. It was carrying something in its hands, not its mouth. Its hands. That afternoon, I called in Lisa Crow, another ranger who worked the eastern districts. Lisa was full Cherokee and knew the old ways better than anyone. When she saw the scene, her face went gray. This isn't an animal, Joe, she said quietly. This is Iwa, the wampus beast. Come on, Lisa. You don't really believe. My great-grandmother saw one when she was young, Lisa cut me off. During the removal, when they were forcing our people west, a woman named Kituwa, cursed for breaking sacred law. She becomes the beast when the moon is dark, hunting those who disrespect the natural world. I wanted to laugh, but something in Lisa's voice stopped me. She was deadly serious. That night, we camped in the management area, taking shifts on watch. Around midnight during my watch, I heard something moving in the forest. Not like a deer or bear. Those animals make noise without caring. This moved like it was trying to stay quiet, but was too big to manage it completely. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the tree line. For just a second, I caught sight of something that made my blood freeze. It was crouched behind a fallen log. And in that brief moment of light, I saw a woman's face looking back at me. But her eyes reflected the light like an animal's, and when she smiled, I saw fangs. Then she was gone, vanishing into the darkness so completely it was like she'd never been there at all. Lisa, I whispered, shaking my partner awake. It's here. We spent the rest of the night back to back, listening to something circle our camp. Sometimes it sounded like a big cat padding through the leaves. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, but it never came close enough for us to see it clearly. When morning came, we found fresh tracks all around our campsite. Human footprints that slowly changed to cougar paws as they led away into the forest. Over the next week, 3 more hunters died. Each death was worse than the last, and each time, the beast grew bolder. Mike Torres was killed while field dressing a deer he'd shot. We found his body torn apart, but the deer was gone, taken by something that had watched him work, then struck when he was most vulnerable. The kill site showed signs of intelligence that chilled me to the bone. Tools arranged in neat rows, hunting equipment organized by size and function. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. Dave Kim died 2 days later, found hanging from a tree branch 30 feet off the ground. No animal could have gotten him up there, but the claw marks on his body were unmistakably feline. Around the base of the tree, we found more stone circles, larger this time, and inside each circle was a human handprint pressed deep into the mud. But it was the third death that broke me. Sarah Mitchell, one of the few female hunters who worked these mountains, was killed while walking back to her truck at sunset. We found her on the trail, positioned like she was sleeping, but her throat had been opened with surgical precision. What haunted me wasn't just her death. It was what we found beside her body. Carved into the earth with claw marks were Cherokee symbols. I couldn't read them, but Lisa could. "It says justice," she translated, her voice barely a whisper. "And remember the old ways." That night, the dreams started. I'd see a Cherokee woman in traditional dress, beautiful but with eyes full of ancient pain. She'd speak to me and share. Okay, words I somehow understood even though I'd never learned the language properly. "You know why I hunt," she would say. "You know what they did wrong." I'd wake up covered in sweat, the yas, taste of blood in my mouth. Lisa and I studied the pattern of attacks, trying to find some logic we could use to stop the killings. What we discovered made everything worse. Every victim had broken hunting laws or ethics in some way. Richardson had been known to waste meat. Torres had been hunting out of season last spring. Kim had been cruel to animals, making them suffer unnecessarily. Even Sarah, who I'd thought was innocent, had been caught poaching deer on private land just last month. It's not just killing, I realized. It's judging, punishing. Iwa is enforcing the old laws, Lisa said. Cherokee hunting traditions that say you must respect what you take, never waste life, never cause unnecessary suffering. But understanding the beast's motivation didn't help us stop it. If anything, it made our job harder. How do you fight something that might actually be right? The next night I saw her clearly for the first time. I was checking the trail cameras we'd set up around the kill sites when she stepped out of the forest like she'd been waiting for me. In the moonlight, she was the most beautiful and terrifying thing I'd ever seen. Tall, with long black hair and traditional Cherokee dress, but her fingernails were curved into claws and her canine teeth were too long and sharp. When she moved, it was with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. "You know me," she said, in perfect English, her voice like wind through pine needles. "Kitua," I whispered. She smiled, and I saw the sadness behind the fangs. "I have been waiting for someone who would understand. Your blood remembers the old ways, even if your mind has forgotten. Why are you doing this?" "Because I must. Because they broke the sacred laws. Because someone must speak for the animals they murder without respect." Her eyes flashed in the darkness. "I was punished for breaking law. Now I enforce it. There has to be another way." "There is," she said, stepping closer. I could smell pine and blood on her skin. "But it requires courage and sacrifice." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone, leaving only footprints that changed from human to animal as they led back into the forest. The answer came to me 3 days later when I was reading through old Cherokee texts Lisa had brought from her grandmother. The curse that created Iwa could be broken, but only through a traditional forgiveness ceremony performed by Cherokee elders. The woman would have to be acknowledged, her punishment recognized as too severe, and her spirit finally allowed to rest. But first, I had to find her in human form. I went into the forest alone that night, carrying tobacco and sage like my grandmother had taught me. At the place where we'd found the first deer, I built a small fire and waited. She came as the moon set, walking out of the darkness in human form. Up close, I could see she was young, maybe 25, with the kind of beauty that stops your heart. But her eyes held centuries of pain. "You came alone," she said, settling across the fire from me. "I figured you wouldn't hurt me. We're both Cherokee. I have killed Cherokee before, when they forgot their duty to the natural world." She looked into the fire. "Do you know what I did to earn this curse? You spied on the men's sacred ceremony. I was curious. My husband was part of the ceremony, and I wanted to understand what they did in secret. So I hid and watched." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. For that moment of curiosity, the elders cursed me to become Iwa, to hunt and kill forever, never aging, never resting, never knowing peace. "But you're not just killing randomly, you're enforcing hunting ethics." "Yes. Over the years, I found purpose in my curse. If I must be a predator, I decided I would prey on those who abuse the natural world." She looked at me across the flames. "But I am tired, Joseph Strongbear, so very tired of killing." "Then let us help you. Let us break the curse." It would require Cherokee elders to admit their ancestors were wrong, to perform the forgiveness ceremony, to acknowledge that my punishment was too severe. She shook her head. "Why would they do this for someone who broke sacred law?" "Because the punishment didn't fit the crime. Because you've suffered enough. Because it's the right thing to do." For a long moment we sat in silence. Then she nodded. "If you can arrange this ceremony, if the elders will truly forgive what I did and release me from this curse, I will submit to their judgment. But if they refuse, you'll keep killing. I will have no choice." The next morning I started making calls. It took 2 weeks and more favors than I'd collected in 20 years of ranger work. But I finally convinced Cherokee elders from 3 different bands to come to Clinch Mountain. They agreed to perform the forgiveness ceremony, though some were skeptical about the whole thing. The ceremony took place on a moonless night at the sacred grove where the first deer had died. The elders formed a circle, burning sage and tobacco, chanting in Cherokee so old I could barely understand it. Keetua came out of the forest in human form, naked and unafraid. She knelt in the center of the circle as the elders began the ritual of forgiveness and release. For an hour, they chanted and prayed. Then the eldest, a man named Robert Ridge, spoke in English. "Keetua of the Wolf Clan, your punishment has been too long and too harsh for your crime. We, as leaders of your people, forgive you and release you from your curse. Go in peace to the spirit world. Your duty is finished." The change was immediate. Keetua's body began to glow with soft light, and I could see her aging rapidly. All the years the curse had stolen from her catching up at once. But she was smiling, and for the first time her eyes showed peace instead of pain. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice growing fainter as her body became translucent. "Take care of the mountain. Protect what cannot protect itself." Then she was gone, leaving only the scent of pine and the sound of wind in the leaves. That was 40 years ago, and I'm still working these mountains. I'm old now, my hair gone white and my back bent from decades of hiking these trails, but I've never forgotten that night, or the woman who taught me that justice and mercy must sometimes walk together. The attacks stopped after the ceremony. Hunters in the area began following stricter ethics, whether from fear or respect I never knew, and didn't much care. The hunting guide started teaching Cherokee principles along with marksmanship. Waste went down, respect went up. I implemented new wildlife management protocols based on traditional Cherokee practices. Other parks started copying our methods when they saw how well they worked. Now there are programs all over the country teaching ethical hunting using Native American wisdom. Every year on the anniversary of Keetua's release, I go back to that grove and leave tobacco and sage. Sometimes I feel like she's still there, watching over the mountain, making sure the old ways aren't forgotten. Lisa retired 5 years ago and moved back to North Carolina to be with her grandchildren. But before she left, She told me something that still gives me chills. "You know why she chose you, don't you?" she said. "Of all the rangers who could have handled this, why you?" "Because I'm Cherokee?" "No, because you were willing to see past the monster to the person underneath. Because you understood that sometimes what looks like evil is really just pain that's gone on too long." I think about that a lot these days, especially when I'm training new rangers. I tell them the story of Kituwa. Some believe it, some don't, but they all remember it. They all understand that the forest has rules older than law books, and that respect for the natural world isn't just good policy, it's survival. Sometimes, on foggy October nights, when the moon is dark, I hear something moving through the trees around my cabin, but I'm not afraid anymore. I know she's at peace now, watching over the mountains she died protecting. The Cherokees say that some spirits never really leave the places they loved in life. If that's true, then Clinch Mountain has a guardian who understands both the old ways and the new, who knows that protecting the natural world sometimes requires protecting it from ourselves. And late at night, when the fog rolls thick through the valleys and the wind sounds like voices in the pines, I sometimes think I can hear her voice one more time. "Remember the old ways, Joseph Strongbear. Teach them to remember." "I will, Kituwa. As long as I draw breath, I will."